The old lion was dying, and the vultures had gathered to feast. Every candle burning in Blackthorn Castle tonight carried the weight of 50 years of power, 50 years of fear, and 50 years of secrets that men would kill to protect. Duke Alaric Ravenshade sat at the head of the grand ballroom, his skeletal hands gripping the armrests of his throne-like chair, watching the masked dancers swirl beneath chandeliers that cost more than entire villages. His eyes, once sharp enough to cut through lies and treaties alike, were now clouded with the fog of approaching death. But they still saw everything, still judged, still remembered. This was the Grand Winter Ball, the event that had defined England's aristocracy for half a century. Tonight, however, the music felt different. The laughter rang hollow. Every smile concealed a knife, and every conversation was a negotiation over the corpse of a dynasty that hadn't quite finished dying yet. And somewhere in that sea of silk and deception, a young woman named Evelyn Ward had just walked through the castle doors carrying a secret that would burn this entire world to ash. Stay with me. What happens next will show you exactly how far people will go when everything they've built stands on a foundation of lies. And I promise you, before this night ends, someone in this room will be dead. Pas intant. The storm had been building since noon, great black clouds rolling in from the north like an invading army. By the time the first carriages arrived at Blackthorn Castle, rain lashed against the stone walls with a violence that felt almost personal. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the Gothic towers and gargoyles that had watched over this cursed place for 300 years. Evelyn Ward stepped out of her hired carriage and immediately felt the cold seep through her borrowed gown. She wasn't supposed to be here. Everything about her presence screamed wrong. The second-hand dress that had been altered 3 times to fit her smaller frame, the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother, the lack of servants or chaperones or any of the trappings that marked real nobility. The invitation had arrived 2 weeks ago, unsigned, with only her name written in elegant script on the envelope. No explanation. No sender. Just an address and a date. And beneath it, a single line that had kept her awake every night since. Your mother's story isn't finished. She climbed the marble steps, rain soaking her hem, while liveried footmen held the massive oak doors open. The warmth inside hit her like a physical force, along with the overwhelming scent of perfume, candle wax, and something darker underneath, the smell of old money and older sins. The entrance hall was a cathedral of excess. Marble columns soared 3 stories high, supporting a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of mythological conquest. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, casting prismatic light across walls lined with portraits of dead raven shades, their painted eyes following every guest with silent accusation. A grand staircase swept upward, splitting into 2 arms that embraced the ballroom entrance like the jaws of some magnificent beast. Evelyn moved through the crowd, invisible. That was one advantage of being nobody. People looked right through you. She watched the real guests arrive. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, wrapped in emerald silk that probably cost more than Evelyn's entire year's salary, her laugh high and brittle as breaking glass. Lord Edward Thornbury, face red from drink and rage, arguing with his mistress in a corner where he thought no one could hear. The Pemberton sisters, twins who had mastered the art of smiling while destroying reputations with carefully chosen whispers. And then she saw him. Cedric Vale stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying his domain. The Duke's nephew was 42 but looked younger, with the kind of aristocratic handsomeness that came from generations of selective breeding. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved from marble. He wore black velvet that fit him like sin, and when he smiled, it never quite reached his eyes. Evelyn watched as he descended the stairs, working the crowd like a politician, touching arms, leaning in close, making every person feel like the most important noble in the room. He had a gift for it, that ability to make you believe he cared while his mind was already calculating how to use you. She knew what he was. Her mother's letters had told her everything. A servant appeared at Cedric's elbow, whispering something urgent. His smile flickered just for a moment, and his eyes scanned the ballroom with predatory focus. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was laughing, waving off whatever concern had been raised. But Evelyn had seen it. The crack in the armor. The fear underneath. He knows something's wrong, she thought. He can feel it. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the dancing began. Couples swirled across the polished floor, a kaleidoscope of color and movement that would have been beautiful if you didn't know what it really was. A performance, carefully choreographed, where every step carried weight and every touch could seal alliances or declare war. Evelyn drifted toward the edges of the ballroom, staying in the shadows where the candlelight didn't quite reach. From here, she could see everything. The Duke in his chair, so still he might have been dead already, except for the occasional movement of his head. Cedric, now dancing with Lady Vivian, their bodies close enough to suggest intimacy, their faces masks of polite conversation that hid God knew what schemes. And then there were the servants. People never noticed the help. They moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying trays of champagne and delicacies, emptying ashtrays, adjusting candles. But Evelyn noticed. She'd spent enough time in service herself to recognize the signs. The careful blank expressions, the way their eyes tracked everything while appearing to see nothing. One servant in particular caught her attention, an older woman, maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was refilling champagne glasses, but her hands shook slightly, and twice Evelyn saw her glance toward the Duke with something that looked like grief or guilt. Evelyn moved closer, circling through the crowd until she was near enough to intercept the woman as she headed back toward the kitchen. "Excuse me?" Evelyn said softly. The servant turned, her face professionally blank. "Yes, miss? I'm looking for someone who might have worked here 20 years ago. A woman named Margaret Ward." The champagne tray trembled. The servant's eyes darted left, then right, checking who might be listening. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here. You need to leave before—" "Before what?" Evelyn pressed. The woman's face had gone pale. "Before he realizes who you are." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd, moving fast despite her age, leaving Evelyn standing alone with her heart pounding and 100 new questions burning in her mind. Across the ballroom, Cedric Vale finished his dance with Lady Vivian and excused himself with a charming smile. He needed air, needed space, needed a moment away from the suffocating performance of caring about these people who would sell their own children for a title and a plot of land. He made his way to one of the side passages, a servants' corridor that ran behind the main rooms. Here, the elegance fell away. Bare stone walls, flickering torches, the smell of cooking and chamber pots. This was the real castle, the skeleton beneath the silk skin. A figure waited in the shadows. "Well?" Cedric demanded. Marcus Dane stepped into the light. He was a lean man, forgettable in appearance, which made him perfect for his work. For 20 years he'd been Cedric's fixer, the one who handled problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. "The girl arrived," Marcus said, "just like you predicted. And the documents? No sign of them yet. But if her mother hid anything before she died, the girl might know where." Cedric's jaw tightened. 20 years. For 20 years he'd believed that particular threat was buried. Margaret Ward had been a persistent problem, a maid who'd seen too much and understood too much, and had made the fatal mistake of trying to use what she knew. He'd dealt with her personally, watched her fall from the North Tower, watched her body break on the stones below, watched as the official report listed it as a tragic accident, a drunken servant who'd lost her footing in the dark. But now her daughter was here, and that meant Margaret had told someone, had written it down, had left evidence. "Find out what she knows," Cedric said quietly. "Be subtle. We can't afford complications tonight, not with the Duke ready to announce his will. And if she becomes a problem, then handle it the same way we handled her mother." Marcus nodded and melted back into the shadows. Cedric stood alone for a moment, forcing his breathing to steady, forcing the mask back into place. He'd come too far to let some dead woman's bastard daughter destroy everything. 20 years of work, 20 years of careful manipulation, of poisoning the old man's mind against his legitimate heirs, of engineering accidents and scandals and convenient deaths. 20 years of positioning himself as the only viable option, the only one strong enough to carry the Ravenshade legacy forward. Tonight, the Duke would make it official. Tonight, Blackthorn Castle and everything attached to it would become Cedric's, unless that girl knew something that could stop it. He smoothed his jacket and returned to the ballroom, his smile bright and empty as a blade. The Duke sat in his chair and watched the dancers, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in memories that grew more vivid as death approached. He thought of his wife, Catherine, dead these 30 years. He thought of the choices he'd made, the compromises, the slow erosion of principle that came with holding power for too long. And he thought of Margaret Ward. The maid had come to him toward the end, pregnant and terrified, carrying documents she'd stolen from Cedric's study, documents that proved his nephew had been systematically stealing from the estate, forging signatures, bribing officials to look the other way. She'd begged for protection, begged him to act, and he'd sent her away. Not because he didn't believe her, but because by then he was too tired to fight, too sick of the constant battles, the endless scheming. Cedric was family, blood, and the idea of exposing him publicly, of admitting that a Ravenshade could be so corrupt, felt like the final surrender to chaos. So he'd sent her away, and 3 days later, she was dead. An accident, they'd said, a tragedy. But Alaric knew better. He'd always known. And now, all these years later, he sat dying in this chair, watching his nephew charm and manipulate the same way he'd been doing since he was 20 years old. And Alaric wondered if maybe this was his punishment, to see clearly, finally, what he'd allowed to flourish in his cowardice, and to know it was too late to stop. The pain in his chest flared, sharp and insistent. His physician had given him something for it, some tincture that dulled the edges but never quite took the agony away. He'd refused stronger doses. He wanted to feel this, wanted to stay awake for what came next. "Your Grace," a voice said beside him. "Are you well?" Alaric turned his head slowly. Lady Margaret Sinclair, one of Catherine's oldest friends, stood there with concern written across her aged face. She was one of the few people left who remembered when this castle had been something more than a stage for ambition. "I am dying, Margaret," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "And we both know it. The question is whether I'll live long enough to fix what I've broken." Her hand found his, thin fingers squeezing with surprising strength. "It's not too late," she whispered. "You can still choose the truth." "Can I?" He laughed, a bitter sound that turned into a cough. "I've made a career of choosing everything but." The music swelled around them, and somewhere in that crowd of glittering vipers, Margaret Ward's daughter was walking into a trap she didn't understand. Alaric closed his eyes and prayed to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, that he'd have the strength to see this through. Evelyn found herself near the refreshment tables, accepting a glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink. The bubbles caught the candlelight, golden and hypnotic, and for just a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to truly belong here. To be the kind of woman who wore these gowns naturally, who knew which fork to use and which nobles to flatter, and how to smile while destroying someone's reputation with 3 carefully chosen words. But that wasn't her world, would never be her world. She set the glass down and moved toward the grand staircase. There had to be records somewhere, documents or journals or something that would confirm what her mother had written in those desperate letters. Evidence that Cedric Vale was a thief and a murderer, that he'd built his reputation on stolen wealth and buried bodies. The problem was finding it. The castle was massive, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that had been added to and modified over 3 centuries. Her mother's letters had mentioned a study, Cedric's private office where he kept his secrets locked away. But where? As she climbed the stairs, trying to look purposeful, a hand caught her arm. Lost? She turned to find a young man, maybe 25, with sandy hair and a kind face that looked out of place among the predators. He wore the simple livery of a footman, but something about his bearing suggested he was more than that. "I was looking for the ladies' retiring room," Evelyn said, pulling her arm free gently. "Wrong direction. It's downstairs past the portrait gallery." His eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're not one of the regulars, are you? Is it that obvious?" He smiled, and it was genuine, only to someone who knows what to look for. "I'm James, by the way. I work in the Duke's private quarters." Evelyn hesitated. Something about this felt like a test, but she couldn't tell what the right answer was. "My name is Evelyn." "I know," James said quietly. "You look just like your mother." The world tilted. "How? She worked here for 8 years. I was just a boy then, but I remember her. She was kind to me when no one else was." He glanced around, checking that they were alone. She was asking questions before she died. Dangerous questions about Cedric Vale. "Do you know what happened to her?" James's expression hardened. Nothing happens in this castle without the Duke knowing, and nothing happens to the Duke's enemies without Cedric's approval. Put those pieces together however you want. Then you'll help me?" He studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't see. Then he nodded slowly. "There's a study on the 3rd floor, East Wing. That's where Cedric keeps his real records. But it's locked, and there are guards. Can you get me in?" "No, but I can create a distraction. Half an hour from now, there's going to be a situation in the kitchens that will require immediate attention. You'll have maybe 10 minutes before someone notices the guards are gone. Why are you doing this?" "Because your mother tried to save this place, and we all let her die for it." James's voice was bitter. Maybe it's time someone finished what she started. He turned and disappeared down the stairs, leaving Evelyn alone with her racing heart and the terrible knowledge that she was about to step into something that could get her killed. Just like her mother. The hours crawled by. Evelyn forced herself to stay in the ballroom, to blend in, to watch, and wait. She saw Cedric dancing with different partners, his charm never faltering. She saw Lady Vivian in a corner with a group of women, their heads bent together in conspiracy. She saw the Duke, still as death in his chair, his eyes tracking movements that only he could see. And she felt time running out. At precisely 11 o'clock, a commotion erupted from the direction of the kitchens, shouting, the crash of breaking dishes, servants running. The guards stationed throughout the ballroom exchanged glances and then moved toward the noise, drawn by training and duty. Evelyn slipped toward the servants' stairs. The 3rd floor was dimmer, lit by wall sconces that threw long shadows. Her footsteps were silent on the thick carpet as she moved down the corridor, past closed doors and darkened rooms. At the end of the hall, she found what she was looking for. A heavy oak door with iron fittings, the kind of door meant to keep secrets in and intruders out. She tried the handle, locked, as expected, but her mother's letters had mentioned something else, a detail that had seemed odd at the time. The Duke's late wife, Catherine, had insisted on having spare keys hidden throughout the castle, a safeguard against being locked out of any room. One such key was hidden in the portrait frame across from Cedric's study. Evelyn examined the large painting, some long-dead Ravenshade ancestor glaring down with imperious disdain. She ran her fingers along the frame's edge until she felt it. A small notch, barely noticeable. She pressed, and a tiny compartment opened, revealing a tarnished brass key. Her hand shook as she fitted into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silent hall. She pushed the door open and stepped into Cedric Vale's private world. The study was smaller than she'd expected, but every surface screamed wealth and power. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface clear except for a single oil lamp and an ornate writing set. Bookshelves lined 2 walls filled with leather-bound volumes that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. A fireplace held glowing coals, keeping the room warm, and filing cabinets. 3 of them, locked. Evelyn moved quickly, knowing her time was limited. She tried the desk drawers first. Most were locked, but one slid open to reveal correspondence, letters in various hands. She rifled through them quickly. Business transactions, social invitations, nothing incriminating. Then she found the false bottom. It was clever, nearly invisible, but her mother had been a maid who'd cleaned this room for years. She'd known every secret it held. Evelyn pressed where the letter had indicated, and the bottom lifted, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside were documents, contracts with forged signatures, bank statements showing systematic theft, letters detailing bribes paid to judges and officials, and beneath it all, a journal in Cedric's own hand, chronicling years of corruption with the casual tone of someone who believed they were untouchable. June 14th, 1803. Arranged accident for Cousin Thomas. Horse spooked on mountain path. Inheritance redirected to me as next in line. October 2nd, 1805. Duke's solicitor becoming suspicious. Applied pressure through his gambling debts. He will cooperate or face ruin. November 17th, 1806. The ward woman knows too much. Marcus will handle it tonight. The North Tower has such unfortunate accidents. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read. Here it was, written in his own words, proof of everything her mother had died trying to expose. She began stuffing documents into her bodice, working fast, knowing that any moment someone might. The door opened behind her. Well, Cedric Vale said softly, Isn't this convenient? Evelyn spun around, her heart exploding in her chest. He stood in the doorway, blocking her only exit, his handsome face calm and cold as winter. I was beginning to wonder when you'd make your move, he continued, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. James played his part perfectly. I assume you think he was helping you. The distraction, the key, all of it had been planned. You look like your mother, Cedric said, circling her slowly. She had the same naive belief that truth mattered, that somehow, if she just exposed the right secrets, justice would prevail. He laughed, a sound without humor. Justice is a fairy tale we tell the poor so they don't burn everything down. You murdered her. I gave her a choice. Leave quietly, take the money I offered, raise her bastard in peace. She chose to be difficult. Cedric shrugged, as if discussing the weather. People who make difficult choices get difficult endings. Evelyn's mind raced. The documents pressed against her skin, evidence that could destroy him. But if she died here, who would ever see them? The Duke knows, she said, desperate. He knows what you've done. Cedric's smile was pitying. The Duke is dying. Tonight, in fact, if his physician's predictions are correct. And when he does, the will he signed last week, the one I carefully prepared, the one witnessed by 3 very reliable judges who owe me considerable favors, will make me the legitimate heir to everything. He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. You can't win, Evelyn. People like you never do. The world is owned by men like me, and it always will be. The best you can hope for is that I make it quick. He reached for her, and Evelyn did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. The sound tore through the castle, high and terrified and impossible to ignore. Cedric's hand clamped over her mouth, but it was too late. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, doors burst open, and suddenly the study was flooding with people. James appeared first, followed by guards, followed by nobles drawn by the commotion. And behind them all, moving slowly but with terrible purpose, came Duke Alaric Ravenshade, supported by Lady Margaret Sinclair. The old man's eyes took in the scene. Cedric with his hand over Evelyn's mouth, the open filing cabinet, the scattered documents. So, Alaric said, his voice carrying despite its weakness, the vulture finally shows his true face. Cedric released Evelyn and straightened, his expression shifting smoothly back to concern. Uncle, this woman broke into my study. I was attempting to restrain her until the guards... Enough. The Duke's word cracked like a whip. I am dying, but I am not yet dead, and I am not blind. He gestured to the documents. Show them. Evelyn pulled the papers from her bodice with shaking hands and held them out. A guard took them, glanced at the contents, and went pale. Your Grace, he said quietly, these appear to be confessions of murder, multiple murders. The crowd pressed closer, shocked whispers spreading like fire. Cedric's mask was slipping, his charm giving way to something cold and reptilian underneath. This is a forgery, he said smoothly, obviously planted by this woman to discredit me. She's nobody, the daughter of a servant, and she comes here with wild accusations. Margaret Ward was murdered, Alaric interrupted, and every eye in the room turned to him. 20 years ago, on my nephew's orders, because she discovered what he truly was. And I knew. He closed his eyes, the weight of that confession crushing. God forgive me, I knew, and I did nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. I was afraid, Alaric continued, his voice breaking. Afraid of scandal, afraid of conflict, afraid to admit that evil had grown in my own house while I looked away. So I let an innocent woman die, and I let her murderer prosper, and I told myself I was being pragmatic. He opened his eyes, and they were fierce despite the tears. But I am dying now, and I will not die a coward's death. He pointed at Cedric with a trembling finger. You are no heir of mine. You are a thief, a murderer, and a snake who has poisoned everything you touched. Guards, arrest him. Let the courts decide his fate, but he will never inherit one stone of this castle. For a moment, no one moved. Then Cedric laughed, high and wild, the sound of a man with nothing left to lose. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think your sudden crisis of conscience matters? I've spent 20 years buying every judge, every official, every person of influence in this county. The courts are mine. The law is mine. In 6 months, I'll be back here, and you'll all be dead or scattered. Perhaps, Alaric said quietly. But tonight, you lose. The guards moved forward. Cedric fought like an animal, clawing and spitting, but he was outnumbered. They dragged him from the study, his curses echoing down the hallway until a door slammed and cut them short. In the sudden quiet, Alaric Ravenshade looked at Evelyn Ward, this slip of a girl who had done what he should have done 20 years ago. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your mother would be proud." Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed into Lady Margaret's arms, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and everyone understood that the old lion's last fight was finally over. Bolpe. The ballroom had emptied by midnight. The nobles had fled like rats from a sinking ship, wanting no connection to the scandal that would consume England's aristocracy for years to come. Only a few remained. James, standing guard at the door, Lady Margaret Sinclair, keeping vigil, and Evelyn, sitting beside the Duke's chair as he fought for each breath. "Tell me about her," Alaric whispered. "Your mother. What was she like?" So Evelyn told him about Margaret Ward's laughter, her strength, her belief that kindness mattered even in a cruel world. She told him about growing up poor but loved, about her mother's stories of Blackthorn Castle, where she'd once believed things could be different. "She died believing you would help her," Evelyn said quietly. "Even at the end, she told me the Duke was a good man who'd lost his way." Alaric's tears fell freely now. "I wasn't worthy of that faith." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but maybe that's the point." She believed anyway. They sat in silence as the candles burned low, and the storm outside finally began to fade. Through the tall windows, the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, gray and cold. "There's a new will," Alaric said suddenly. "In my desk. I had it drawn up a week ago after I received a letter. Anonymous, but I knew the handwriting. Someone who cared sent me copies of Cedric's documents, enough to make me look deeper." He smiled faintly. "I suspect it was James." The footman shifted slightly, but said nothing. "The will leaves everything to a trust," Alaric continued, "managed by Lady Margaret and a board of people I actually trust. Not for my family, they've proven themselves unworthy, but for the people who live in the shadow of this castle, for the servants and tenant farmers and everyone we've exploited for centuries." He looked at Evelyn. "There's a provision for you as well. An inheritance and a position on the board if you'll take it." "I don't want your money," Evelyn said. "I know. That's precisely why you should have it. Use it to finish what your mother started. Make this place mean something." His breathing was getting shallower. Lady Margaret took his other hand, and they waited together as the dawn broke over Blackthorn Castle, washing away the last shadows of night. Alaric Ravenshade died as the first rays of sun touched the ballroom floor. His last words were so quiet that only Evelyn heard them. "Tell her I'm sorry." 3 days later, the story broke in every newspaper in England. The arrest of Cedric Vale, the confessions of murder, the web of corruption that had entangled half the aristocracy. Trials were scheduled. Fortunes would be lost. The scandal would reshape the power structure of an entire nation. But in Blackthorn Castle, things were quiet. Evelyn stood in the Duke's study, now her study, though she couldn't quite believe it, and looked out at the grounds. Snow had begun to fall, soft and clean, covering the darkness underneath. James appeared in the doorway. "The first meeting is scheduled for next week. The tenant farmers' representatives will be there." "Good." She turned to face him. "Thank you for sending those documents to the Duke, for giving him the chance to make it right." James shrugged uncomfortably. "Seemed like the least I could do. It was more than anyone else did." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd survived the collapse of a dynasty, uncertain what came next. From somewhere below, Evelyn heard voices, the servants preparing the castle for whatever new life it would have. No more balls for nobility. No more performances of power and wealth. Something different was beginning here, something that would take years to build and might fail completely. But at least it would be honest. At least they would try. Evelyn picked up her mother's final letter, the one she'd read 100 times, and read it once more. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, I am gone. But please know I tried to make things better. I tried to stand against the darkness, even though I knew it would cost me. You don't have to be brave like I was. You don't have to fight like I did. But if you choose to, if you decide that truth matters more than safety, then know that I am so very proud. The world breaks good people. But sometimes, if we're lucky, good people break the world right back. I love you. Be strong. Be careful. And never, ever stop believing that better is possible. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she got to work. Because the real fight, the fight to actually change something, to make the privilege mean responsibility instead of exploitation, was just beginning. And somewhere in hell or heaven or whatever came after, Margaret Ward was watching her daughter pick up the sword she'd dropped, and she was smiling. But in a prison cell in London, Cedric Vale sat in darkness and smiled too. Because he'd told the truth about one thing. He'd spent 20 years buying every judge, every official, every person who mattered, and his trial was scheduled for next month, in front of a judge who owed him everything. The prison cell smelled like iron and piss, and the particular kind of despair that seeps into stone after centuries of containing broken men. But Cedric Vale sat on the narrow cot with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for tea service, not a trial that could end with his neck stretched on the gallows. Marcus Dane stood outside the bars, hat in hand, looking like every loyal servant who'd ever delivered bad news to a master who didn't tolerate failure. "The girl's been appointed to the trust board," Marcus said quietly. "They're calling her the voice of reform. Parliament's watching. The newspapers won't shut up about her." Cedric's expression didn't change. Parliament watches whatever the mob tells them to watch. Mobs get bored. Newspapers find new scandals. "Tell me about Thornton." "He's nervous. Says the attention makes things difficult." "Everything makes things difficult for Thornton. That's why we own him." Cedric stood and moved to the small barred window, looking out at the London street below where people hurried past in the rain, every one of them convinced their little lives mattered. "Did you remind him what happens if he develops a conscience?" "I reminded him about the photographs." "Good. And Whitmore?" "Solid. He owes you his seat on the bench and 3 country estates. He's not going anywhere." Cedric turned back to face Marcus, and for just a moment, the mask slipped enough to show what lived underneath. Cold calculation mixed with something that might have been fear if he'd been the kind of man who allowed himself to feel it. "The trial is in 6 weeks, Cedric said. 6 weeks for that girl to dig deeper, for someone to grow a spine, for this whole beautiful machine I built to come apart. I need insurance. What kind? The kind that makes everyone understand what happens when they cross me." Cedric moved closer to the bars. "Lady Vivian Ashcombe has a ledger. Names, dates, transactions. Everyone who ever paid her for information or bought her silence. Get it. She'll never give it up. It's her protection. Then make her understand that protection only works if she's alive to use it." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "That's a line we haven't crossed before. We crossed every line 20 years ago. We just got better at hiding the bodies." Cedric's voice went soft and deadly. "I built this empire on the understanding that I would do what others wouldn't, that I would push further, risk more, destroy harder. Every man in that courtroom knows it. Every official I own knows it. So when they're sitting in their comfortable homes deciding whether to honor their agreements or betray me to save their reputations, I need them to remember exactly who I am." The guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor. Marcus stepped back from the bars. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I know you will, because if you don't, I'll make sure they know everything about Sheffield." Marcus went rigid. "That was 20 years ago. The boy was already dying." "The boy was murdered, and you held the pillow. Doesn't matter that I ordered it. Doesn't matter that he was a blackmailer who deserved worse. What matters is your hands were the ones that did it, and I made certain there's proof." Cedric smiled, all teeth and empty warmth. "We're bound together, Marcus. All the way to hell. Don't forget it." When Marcus was gone, Cedric returned to his cot and lay back, staring at the water-stained ceiling. He ran through the calculations again, measuring odds, counting resources, identifying which pieces on the board could be sacrificed and which had to be protected. The girl was a problem, not because she was smart. Plenty of smart people had tried to destroy him, but because she represented something dangerous, the idea that justice could matter more than power, that the rules could apply to everyone equally, that good could somehow triumph over the machinery of corruption that had run England's aristocracy for centuries. It was a pretty fairy tale, and like all fairy tales, it would crash against the rocks of reality and drown in deep water. He just had to be patient. Evelyn Ward stood in the great hall of Blackthorn Castle and tried to breathe through the pressure crushing her chest. Around the massive oak table sat 12 men, each one representing a different faction: tenant farmers, estate managers, solicitors, local merchants. They all watched her with varying degrees of skepticism, hostility, or barely concealed contempt. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a servant, and she was supposed to convince these men to dismantle everything they'd spent their lives building. "The proposal is simple," she said, keeping her voice steady even though her hands shook under the table. "Every tenant farmer currently pays 70% of their crop yield to the estate. We reduce it to 40%. The difference comes from selling off the Duke's collection of art and antiquities that are currently gathering dust in storage." Robert Michaels, the estate manager who'd held his position for 30 years, leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man watching a child try to explain mathematics to a professor. "Simple," he repeated. "Miss Ward, do you have any idea how the estate economy functions? Those rents support 200 staff positions, maintain the castle infrastructure, pay taxes to the crown." "I've read the books," Evelyn interrupted. "The same books that show we spent £8,000 last year on wine for parties that no one will ever throw again. 12,000 on maintaining hunting grounds that will never be hunted. 6,000 on a stable of horses for guests who don't exist anymore. Those are traditional expenses." "They're waste," Evelyn said flatly. "And while we're spending money on tradition, people are starving. Children are dying of diseases that better nutrition could prevent. That's not tradition. That's murder dressed in velvet." The room went silent. Several men shifted uncomfortably, but Thomas Webb, who represented the tenant farmers and had hands scarred from 60 years of field work, was nodding slowly. "The girl's right," he said in a voice rough as tree bark. "My grandson died last winter because we couldn't afford the doctor. But there's a painting in the East Wing that's worth more than my whole family will earn in 10 lifetimes. Tell me how that makes sense." "It doesn't have to make sense," Michaels shot back. "It's the way things are, the way they've always been." "Then maybe it's time things changed," Lady Margaret Sinclair said from the head of the table. Her voice carried the weight of decades navigating aristocratic politics. The Duke's will was explicit. This estate will serve the people who make it function, not the other way around. "With respect, Lady Margaret," a solicitor named Pemberton interjected, "the courts may overturn that will. Cedric Vale's trial hasn't concluded. If he's acquitted—" "He won't be," Evelyn said. "You sound very certain." "Because I've seen the evidence. He confessed to multiple murders in his own journal." Pemberton smiled thinly. "Evidence can be challenged. Journals can be forged. And Mr. Vale has retained the finest legal counsel money can buy. I'm simply suggesting we might want to move carefully until we know which way the wind is blowing." "The wind is blowing toward justice," Evelyn said, but even as she spoke, she felt the doubt creeping in. Because Pemberton was right. Rich men didn't hang. They bought their way out or found loopholes or called in favors from judges who owed them everything. The vote was called. 8 men voted to approve the reduced rents. 4 abstained, which meant they opposed it but didn't want their names attached to voting against fairness. It was a victory, technically. It felt like defeat. After the meeting ended, James found her in the library, staring at shelves full of books she'd never have time to read. "You did well," he said. "I barely held the room. Half of them think I'm a child playing at reform. The other half are waiting for Cedric to walk free so they can go back to the old ways. Then we make sure he doesn't walk free." "How?" "The trial is rigged. You said it yourself. He owns everyone." James moved closer, his voice dropping. "Not everyone. There are people who want to help, people in positions where they can make a difference. But they need proof that Cedric's network is vulnerable. They need to see him bleed." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's a woman in London, Lady Vivian Ashcombe. She has a ledger that documents every corrupt transaction, every bribe, every piece of blackmail in aristocratic society for the last 20 years. If we could get that ledger, she'd never give it up. It's the only thing keeping her alive." "Maybe." James hesitated. "Or maybe she's tired of being afraid. Maybe she wants out but doesn't know how to get there safely." Evelyn turned to face him fully. "You want me to go to London, to approach a woman who has every reason to want me dead, to ask her to betray every powerful person in England?" "Yes." "And if she refuses? If she tells Cedric I'm there? Then we improvise." James's expression was grim. But if we don't try, if we just sit here and wait for the trial to play out, we've already lost. Cedric's entire strategy is based on people being too afraid to act. Someone has to break the pattern. Evelyn thought about her mother, walking into the Duke's study 20 years ago with stolen documents and a desperate hope that truth would matter. She thought about how that hope had gotten her thrown from a tower. But she also thought about Thomas Webb's grandson, dead because poverty killed slower than murder, but just as thoroughly. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow night." "And Miss Ward?" James's face was serious. "Once we do this, there's no going back. If Vivian talks, if Cedric finds out, everyone we love becomes a target. Then we'd better not fail." Lady Vivian Ashcombe lived in a townhouse in Mayfair that cost more than most estates. The exterior was elegant Georgian architecture, all proportion and restraint. Inside was a different story. Every room stuffed with treasures from around the world, silk wallpaper from China, carpets from Persia, sculptures from Italy. The accumulated loot of a woman who'd spent 30 years turning other people's secrets into currency. She received Evelyn in a drawing room that smelled of jasmine and old perfume. Vivian was 53 but looked younger, maintaining her beauty through expensive creams, strategic corsets, and the kind of ruthless discipline that came from understanding that appearance was armor in a world designed to discard women the moment they stopped being decorative. "Miss Ward," she said, gesturing to a chair with one ring-covered hand. "How unexpected. And how very dangerous for you to be here." Evelyn sat, forcing herself to meet Vivian's eyes. "I need your help." "Do you?" Vivian poured tea from a silver service, the sound of liquid hitting porcelain almost obscene in the quiet room. "And what makes you think I have any interest in helping the girl who's trying to destroy the social order I've spent my life navigating? Because that social order is about to destroy you." Vivian's hand paused, just for a second, before continuing to pour. Dramatic words from someone who's been playing this game for all of 3 months. "Cedric Vale is going to walk free," Evelyn said bluntly. "His trial is fixed, and when he does, he's going to eliminate every loose end, every potential threat. Your ledger makes you the biggest threat of all. My ledger makes me untouchable. If anything happens to me, instructions go to 3 different newspapers. Instructions from a dead woman. Vivian, they'll print your ledger as a scandal, sell 1 million copies, and forget about you before your corpse is cold. That's not protection. That's just revenge from beyond the grave." The teacup rattled slightly as Vivian set it down. "You're very direct. I don't have time to be anything else." Evelyn leaned forward. "You've survived this long by being smarter than everyone around you, by seeing patterns and reading people and staying 3 steps ahead. So, read me now. Tell me I'm wrong." Vivian studied her with eyes that had seen everything ugly that money and power could do. When she spoke, her voice was tired. "You're not wrong. I've known for years that this couldn't last, that eventually someone would decide I knew too much, and my insurance policy wouldn't be enough." She laughed bitterly. "Do you know what it's like to spend 30 years building walls around yourself, only to realize you've just made a prettier prison? Then help me tear it down. And what do I get? Safety? There's no such thing. Redemption? I'm decades past that." "Justice," Vivian shook her head. "Justice is for people who can afford lawyers. You get to choose how your story ends." Evelyn's voice was fierce. "Right now you're a blackmailer who'll die alone in this house, surrounded by beautiful things that won't mourn you. But you could be the woman who brought down the most corrupt network in English history, the woman who proved that even someone covered in dirt can do something clean." Vivian was quiet for a long time. Outside, London moved through its evening rhythms, carriages rattling past, street vendors calling their wares, the constant hum of a city that never quite slept. "The ledger is in a bank vault," Vivian finally said. "Coots and Company. Access requires my presence and a key I keep on my person at all times. If anything happens to me before we can get to it, then we make sure nothing happens to you." "You say that like it's simple. Like Cedric doesn't have people watching every move I make." "Does he?" Vivian smiled without humor. "There's a man across the street. Been there for 2 weeks, changes shifts every 8 hours. Very professional. And there's probably someone watching the back entrance. So even if I wanted to help you, and I'm not saying I do, Walking out of here with you would sign both our death warrants. The pieces clicked together in Evelyn's mind. You knew I was coming. That's why you agreed to see me. You wanted them to know we met. Vivian's smile widened. You're smarter than you look. Yes, I wanted them to see. Because now Cedric knows I'm talking to his enemy. Now he has to decide, does he move against me immediately, which risks the ledger going public? Or does he wait, which gives me time to make copies, spread evidence, create problems? She leaned back in her chair. Either way, I forced his hand, made him react instead of plan. Sometimes that's the best you can do. But that puts you in immediate danger. I've been in danger since the day I decided to keep records instead of burning them. At least this way, I'm choosing the battlefield. Vivian stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street below. There's a carriage, 2 men inside. They're not even pretending anymore. Then we need to move now. We need to move smart. Vivian turned back to face her. Tomorrow night, there's a gala at the Rothschild estate. Every corrupt official, every compromised judge, every player in Cedric's network will be there, including the man currently watching my house. That gives us a window. To do what? To rob a bank. Cedric sat in his cell and stared at the letter Marcus had delivered. It was from Judge Whitmore, written in the careful language of a man trying to communicate bad news without putting anything incriminating on paper. The political climate presents unexpected challenges. Public opinion has shifted considerably. Maintaining previous commitments may prove complicated. Advise extreme caution regarding secondary strategies. Translation: the judge was getting nervous. The newspapers wouldn't stop covering the trial. Parliament was paying attention. Ruling in Cedric's favor had become too visible, too likely to destroy Whitmore's own reputation. Coward, Cedric muttered. But he understood. Fear was a tool he'd used his entire life, but it was unreliable. Terrified people did unpredictable things. They confessed to priests. They wrote letters to their mistresses. They developed consciences at the worst possible moments. He needed a new approach, something that would remind everyone why they'd been afraid in the first place. Marcus, he called. The guard unlocked the cell door, another small reminder that Cedric's influence reached even here. Marcus stepped inside, his face carefully neutral. Tell me about the girl. She's staying at Blackthorn Castle, barely goes anywhere. James Kellerman is always nearby. The footman. Cedric's eyes narrowed. He's more than he appears, isn't he? Used to be a soldier, fought in the colonial campaigns, came back with nightmares and scars and a distrust of authority. The Duke gave him a position out of charity, or strategy. Alaric was always playing longer games than anyone gave him credit for. Cedric drummed his fingers on his knee, thinking, is there anyone at the castle we can turn? Someone desperate enough to take money and forget their morals? Everyone has a price. It's just a matter of finding it. Then find it. I want to know everything she does, everyone she meets, every plan she makes. And Marcus? Cedric's voice went cold. When the opportunity presents itself, I want her gone. Not loud, not obvious, just gone. Make it look like an accident or a tragedy or a runaway servant girl who couldn't handle the pressure. I don't care. But she needs to disappear before the trial. That's a significant escalation. That's survival. She's become a symbol. As long as she's alive, people will believe reform is possible. But symbols die like anyone else. And once she's dead, this whole movement falls apart. Because it was never about justice. It was about one girl's revenge fantasy. Cedric stood and moved to the window, looking out at the same gray sky that covered all of London. Remove the girl, and everyone remembers why they were afraid, why they stayed in line, why the old ways persisted for so long. And what about Lady Vivian? Working on it. She'll cooperate, or she'll join Margaret Ward at the bottom of a very deep hole. Marcus left without another word. Cedric returned to his cot and closed his eyes, running scenarios, planning contingencies, building the architecture of other people's destruction with the same focus an artist might bring to a masterpiece. He'd spent his entire life understanding one fundamental truth. The world belonged to whoever was willing to be more ruthless, more patient, more brutal than their opponents. Everyone else talked about honor and justice and right and wrong. They were sheep pretending to be wolves. Cedric Vale was the wolf who'd stopped pretending, and he was about to remind England exactly what that meant. The rain came down like judgment on the night of the Rothschild Gala. Evelyn stood in an alley 3 blocks from Coots in Compen, wearing a servant's dress that James had stolen from the townhouse where he'd grown up. Her hair was tucked under a cap, her face smudged with dirt, her hands roughened with ash to hide their softness. "You look like you belong," James said, appearing beside her in footman's livery. "That's good. Nobody sees servants. Where's Vivian?" "Already at the gala. She'll make sure everyone important sees her there. Gives her an alibi. We have 2 hours before anyone notices the bank's been entered, assuming we can get in." James pulled a key from his pocket. "Used to work security there before the war. They never changed the locks. Lazy bastards." They moved through the rain-slicked streets, just 2 more servants on errands, invisible to the carriages rolling past. The bank loomed ahead, a temple to money with columns and marble and windows dark as dead eyes. James's key turned smoothly in the side entrance. They slipped inside, water dripping from their clothes onto floors that had never been touched by anything so common as rain. "The vault is in the basement," James whispered. 3 doors. I can get us through the first 2. The third requires Vivian's key. Then how—" Evelyn turned to find Lady Vivian Ashcombe standing in the shadows, wrapped in a dark cloak, her face pale but determined. "You really think I'd trust anyone else to do this?" Vivian asked. "I've been playing the coward for 30 years. Tonight, I'm done." They moved through the bank like ghosts, every footstep echoing in the silence. Down the marble staircase, through the first door that James picked, with tools that looked military-grade, past the second door that opened with a key James definitely shouldn't have had access to. At the third door, Vivian produced her key with shaking hands. For a moment, Evelyn thought she might change her mind, might decide that safety mattered more than anything else. But Vivian inserted the key and turned it, and the vault door swung open with a whisper of expensive hinges. Inside was a small room lined with safe deposit boxes. Vivian went directly to number 237, used a second key, and pulled out a leather-bound ledger that looked ancient and valuable and damning. "Every secret I've collected," she said quietly. "Every corruption, every crime. 3 decades of England's nobility destroying each other and themselves." She held it out to Evelyn. "Don't waste it." Evelyn took the ledger, feeling the weight of it, understanding that what she held was enough explosive to reshape an entire nation's power structure. They were halfway up the stairs when they heard footsteps above. James grabbed both women and pulled them into an alcove, his hand over Evelyn's mouth, his body pressed against hers in a space too small for 3 people. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices. "Absolutely certain someone came through here." The lock was warm. Could have been anyone. Cleaning staff? Security? Check the vault anyway. Mr. Vale was very clear about watching this location. Evelyn's heart hammered so loud she was certain they could hear it. Beside her, Vivian had gone rigid with terror, and James's hand on his knife suggested he was ready to do something desperate if they were discovered. The footsteps moved toward the vault entrance, stopped, then returned, moving away. "Probably nothing. Place gives me the creeps anyway. Come on, we'll check the upper floors." When the voices faded, James waited another full minute before releasing them. They climbed the rest of the stairs in silence and slipped out the side entrance into rain that felt like baptism, washing away the sweat and fear. Evelyn clutched the ledger to her chest and ran. Behind them, London slept, unaware that its entire foundation was about to crack open. Oh. They gathered at a safe house James knew, a shabby room above a tavern where the landlord asked no questions as long as the rent was paid. Evelyn spread the ledger open on a table scarred by decades of use and began reading by candlelight. The first entries were from 1800. Minor things at first. Bribes paid to magistrates, affairs covered up, gambling debts forgiven in exchange for political favors. But as the years progressed, the crimes grew worse. Murders arranged and covered. Children sold to pay family debts. Judges bought and owned. Elections rigged. Witnesses disappeared. And woven through it all, Cedric Vale's name appearing again and again, sometimes as a participant, sometimes as the orchestrator, always as the spider at the center of the web. "This is enough to destroy half of Parliament," Evelyn whispered. "Half the judiciary. God, there are bishops in here, which is exactly why they'll fight like hell to keep it buried." Vivian had poured herself a generous glass of whiskey and was drinking it with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying to forget. You think you've won because you have evidence, but evidence doesn't matter if no one will look at it. Every person named in that ledger has resources, connections, motivation to make this disappear. Then we make it impossible to disappear. We make copies, send them to newspapers that are owned by people in that ledger. Then Parliament, also in the ledger. James slammed his hand on the table. Then what the hell are we supposed to do? We have proof of everything, proof that should hang 100 men, and you're saying it doesn't matter? I'm saying it matters, but not the way you think. Vivian leaned forward. Power doesn't care about proof. It cares about exposure. You want to destroy these people? You don't send the ledger to their friends. You send it to their enemies. You find everyone they've ever screwed over, everyone waiting for revenge, everyone with nothing to lose. You give them weapons and let them choose violence. That's not justice, Evelyn said quietly. No, it's revolution. And maybe that's what this moment needs. The candle flickered, casting shadows that made them all look like conspirators planning treason, which, Evelyn supposed, was exactly what they were. Outside, the rain had stopped. Dawn was coming, gray and cold, bringing with it the day when they would have to choose, play by rules designed to protect the powerful, or burn the whole system down and hope something better grew from the ashes. Evelyn thought about her mother, dead at the bottom of a tower because she'd believed truth would be enough. She thought about Thomas Webb's grandson, dead because poverty was violence in slow motion. She thought about all the children who would keep dying, all the people who would keep suffering, all the cruelty that would continue forever if nothing changed. And she made her choice. Make the copies, she said to James, every page. And then we send them everywhere, to every newspaper, every member of parliament, every judge not in the ledger. We flood the country with truth until it's impossible to ignore. That will start a war. Good. She met his eyes. Maybe it's time the powerful learned what it feels like to be afraid. The copies spread across London like plague. By dawn, every major newspaper had received a package. By noon, the streets were chaos. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, outside courthouses, outside the homes of men whose names appeared in Vivian's ledger. The words corruption and justice were shouted until they lost meaning, until they became just noise layered over the deeper sound of a society realizing how thoroughly it had been poisoned. Evelyn stood at the window of the safe house and watched smoke rise from 3 different districts where people had decided fire was the appropriate response to decades of systematic betrayal. Part of her felt sick at the violence. The rest of her understood that sometimes you couldn't cut out rot without drawing blood. James appeared behind her, his face grim. The trial's been postponed. Judge Whitmore recused himself an hour ago. Half of Parliament is calling for investigations. The other half is calling for your arrest. For what crime? Theft, breaking and entering, conspiracy to distribute stolen documents. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Let them try. Evelyn turned to face him. We have proof of everything. They can't make this go away just by arresting me. Can't they? James moved closer, his voice low and urgent. These are people who've made entire families disappear, who've rewritten history to suit their narratives. You think a few pieces of paper will stop them? Those few pieces of paper are in every newspaper in London right now. They're being copied and distributed. By tomorrow, everyone in England will know what these men did. And by tomorrow, you'll be dead in a ditch somewhere with a knife in your back and a story about how you were a disturbed young woman who couldn't handle the pressure of her sudden elevation. James grabbed her shoulders, his grip almost painful. You think you've won because the truth is out. But truth doesn't protect you when the people who own the police want you gone. Then what do you suggest? That we run? Hide? I suggest we recognize that we've just declared war on the most powerful people in England, and wars have casualties. Before Evelyn could respond, Vivian burst through the door, her face pale and her hands shaking. We have a problem. Add it to the list, James muttered. Vivian ignored him, focusing on Evelyn. I just received a message. Anonymous. Delivered by a street urchin. It says that Marcus Dane has been arrested, and that he's negotiating a deal. What kind of deal? The kind where he gives testimony about everyone he worked for, everyone he killed for, everyone who gave orders. Vivian's voice was hollow. Including me. The room went cold. Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her, understanding cascading through her mind like falling dominoes. If Marcus talked, if he detailed every crime Vivian had knowledge of, every person she'd blackmailed, every secret she'd kept, "They'll hang you," Evelyn said quietly. "Worse, they'll make me the villain of this entire story. The blackmailer who orchestrated corruption for personal profit, who manipulated a naive girl into stealing documents, who used the ledger to destroy reputations out of spite." Vivian laughed, a broken sound. "And the beautiful thing is, it's partly true. I did blackmail people. I did profit from their crimes. The fact that I kept records doesn't make me a hero. It makes me a criminal with good documentation. But you helped us expose—" "I helped myself." Vivian's eyes were fierce. "Don't paint me as something I'm not. I spent 30 years destroying people for money. The fact that I finally destroyed the right people doesn't erase that. And Marcus knows enough about my methods to make me look like the architect of everything. Then we discredit him first. Show that he's a murderer trying to save himself." "With what proof?" He was careful. They're always careful. James was pacing now, the small room feeling smaller with each pass. This is exactly what Cedric wanted. Chaos. Uncertainty. Everyone pointing fingers at each other while he sits in his cell looking like the victim of a conspiracy. A knock at the door froze them all. James's hand went to his knife. Vivian stepped back against the wall. Evelyn moved toward the door, her heart hammering, knowing this could be police or assassins or just a drunk who'd stumbled to the wrong room. She opened it to find Thomas Webb standing there, the old farmer who'd voted for reform at the castle meeting. His face was carved from grief and rage. "They killed my daughter," he said without preamble. "Found her this morning in the river. Officially it's a drowning, but she had bruises on her throat. Fingerprints." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Evelyn felt the room spin, felt the weight of cause and effect crushing her chest. "I'm so sorry," she managed. Sorry doesn't bring her back. Thomas stepped inside, and in the candlelight, he looked ancient. They left a note in her pocket. Said, "This is what happens to families of troublemakers." Said, "If I don't withdraw my support for the reforms, my grandson is next." "Jesus Christ," James whispered. "No Christ in this boy. Just men with power doing what they've always done when someone threatens their comfort." Thomas looked at Evelyn with eyes that had seen too much. "I came to tell you I'm withdrawing. I'm taking my family and leaving the county, and I suggest you do the same because these people will kill everyone you love and sleep fine afterwards. We can protect you." "You can't even protect yourself." Thomas shook his head. "You started something brave, girl, but bravery doesn't stop knives in the dark. It just makes for prettier eulogies." He left without another word, and the door closing behind him sounded like a coffin lid. Vivian was the first to speak. "It's Cedric. Even from prison, he's orchestrating this, showing everyone what happens when you cross him." "Then we need to stop him permanently," James said. "No more playing by rules, no more waiting for justice. We go to that prison tonight and we end this." "You mean murder him?" "I mean remove the threat." "That makes us exactly like them," Evelyn said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was thinking about Thomas Webb's daughter, dead because she'd dared to hope. She was thinking about her own mother, broken on stones because she'd asked questions. She was thinking about how many more people would die if Cedric Vale continued to breathe. "Sometimes you have to become what you hate to destroy it," James said quietly. "I learned that in the war. The enemy doesn't care about your principles. They care about winning, and they'll use your morality against you every single time." "No." Evelyn's voice was firm despite the chaos in her mind. "We don't kill him. We destroy him legally, publicly, in a way that can't be undone or rewritten. We find evidence so damning that even his bought judges can't ignore it." "That evidence doesn't exist," Vivian said flatly. "Believe me, I looked for 30 years. Cedric's too careful, too smart. Everything that could hang him is locked in his head or buried so deep it'll never surface. Then we make him confess." "Make a man like that confess?" James laughed bitterly. "You'd need leverage we don't have." "What if we do?" Evelyn turned to Vivian. "You said Marcus is negotiating. What if we negotiate faster? What if we offer him something better than what the prosecution can give?" "Like what?" "Immunity, safety, a new identity." Everything he needs to disappear completely if he testifies against Cedric instead of you. Why would he take that deal? Because the alternative is we leak his name as someone who's cooperating, and when Cedric finds out, and he will, Marcus becomes a dead man. Evelyn's voice was cold now, shaped by necessity into something she barely recognized. We force him to choose, testify against the man who owns him, or die by that same man's orders. That's extortion. Yes, it is. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of lines being crossed, of principles being abandoned, of three people recognizing that survival in a world designed by monsters sometimes required monstrous choices. "I'll make contact," Vivian finally said. "I know people who can get messages into holding cells, but if this backfires, if Marcus tells Cedric what we're planning, then we're dead anyway. Might as well die trying." The message reached Marcus Dane in a holding cell that smelled like fear and last chances. It was delivered by a guard who'd been bought years ago for a sum that seemed significant then, but laughable now, written on paper thin enough to burn quickly if necessary. "They're coming for you. You know too much. Testify against Vale or be his next victim. Safe passage guaranteed. Your choice." Marcus read it 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of the loyalty he'd built over 20 years of following orders and burying bodies. He thought about Sheffield, the boy he'd suffocated on Cedric's command. He thought about Margaret Ward, whose death he'd helped arrange. He thought about Thomas Webb's daughter, strangled by men he'd hired just 2 days ago. And he thought about how Cedric Vale had looked at him in that cell, eyes cold and empty, delivering threats wrapped in courtesy, because that's what predators did when they owned you completely. The guard returned an hour later. "Well?" Marcus looked up from his cot where he'd been sitting motionless, running calculations, weighing odds, measuring the cost of continued loyalty against the price of betrayal. "Set up the meeting," he said quietly. "I'll tell them everything." Hotek. Cedric felt it the moment the architecture began to collapse. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, the way guards looked at him differently, the way his solicitor's visits became shorter and more evasive. Then came the official notification delivered by a magistrate who could barely hide his satisfaction. "Your associate Marcus Dane has agreed to provide testimony for the prosecution. His statement implicates you in 17 murders, systematic fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The trial will proceed in 3 days. Your Grace, I suggest you prepare your affairs." Cedric's face remained calm, but inside everything was ice and calculation and the cold recognition that for the first time in his life, he'd miscalculated. Marcus was supposed to be terrified of him, was supposed to understand that betrayal meant death, not just for himself, but for everyone he'd ever cared about. But maybe that was the problem. Marcus didn't care about anyone, had spent 20 years becoming exactly the kind of empty vessel that Cedric himself was. And empty vessels didn't respond to threats because they had nothing left to lose. He'd created his own monster, and now it was devouring him. When the magistrate left, Cedric sat alone in his cell and did something he hadn't done in decades. He felt fear, not the surface anxiety that came with temporary setbacks. Real fear, the kind that lived in your bones and whispered that this might actually be the end, that all the planning and manipulation and careful construction of power networks might collapse, because one man decided his own survival mattered more than loyalty to a master who would have killed him eventually anyway. He had 3 days to fix this. 3 days to find leverage, or create chaos, or engineer one final miracle that would save him from the gallows. The problem was, he'd burned every bridge getting here. Every ally was compromised. Every favor had been called in. Every person who owed him something had decided their debts were negotiable once their own necks were at risk. For the first time in his life, Cedric Vale understood what it felt like to be powerless. He hated it. The testimony began on a morning that felt like execution weather, gray and cold with rain threatening, but never quite falling. Marcus Dane sat in the witness box, looking smaller than Evelyn remembered, his voice steady as he detailed 2 decades of crimes with the detached tone of someone reading a shopping list. On November 17, 1806, I received orders from Cedric Vale to eliminate a servant named Margaret Ward. She had discovered evidence of financial fraud and theft. I arranged for her to fall from the north tower of Blackthorn Castle. The death was ruled accidental. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People standing in aisles and pressed against walls, everyone desperate to witness the moment when England's aristocracy finally faced consequences. Evelyn sat in the gallery between James and Vivian, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. Across the room, Cedric Vale sat at the defense table, flanked by two solicitors who looked increasingly desperate. He hadn't looked at Marcus once. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Evelyn, cold and measuring, as if he was calculating exactly how much her death would cost and deciding whether it was worth the investment. She met his gaze and didn't look away. This was her mother's vindication, her mother's justice. 20 years late and bought with blood, but justice nonetheless. The prosecutor stood, a sharp-faced man named Blackwood, who'd made his career destroying people. "Can you describe other murders you committed at Mr. Vale's direction?" Marcus nodded slowly. June 14th, 1803. Thomas Vale, Cedric's cousin. Made it look like his horse spooked on a mountain path. October 1809. Edmund Cartwright, a solicitor who was investigating the estate's finances. Poison in his wine. April 1812. Sarah Pemberton, who threatened to expose Mr. Vale's relationship with her husband. Her carriage wheel was sabotaged. The list continued. Name after name, date after date, method after method. The courtroom was silent except for Marcus's voice and the sound of the court recorder's pen scratching across paper, documenting crimes that would fill history books and haunt classrooms for generations. When Marcus finally finished, the prosecutor turned to the jury with theatrical precision. 17 murders. Decades of theft and fraud, all orchestrated by one man who believed himself above the law. He pointed at Cedric. "This man sitting before you isn't a nobleman. He's a plague who's infected English society for 20 years. The defense attorney stood, his face red and his movements jerky with barely contained panic. "Your Honor, this witness is a confessed murderer attempting to save himself by implicating my client. His testimony is unreliable, self-serving. Is it?" Blackwood held up a document. "Because we have Mr. Vale's personal journal, recovered from his study, documenting these exact crimes in his own handwriting. We have bank records showing payments to Mr. Dane corresponding to each murder date. We have letters, contracts, financial transactions. The only thing unreliable here is any claim that Cedric Vale is innocent." The defense attorney looked at Cedric, and even from across the room, Evelyn could see the panic in his eyes. The look of a man realizing his client was drowning and dragging everyone nearby under with him. That's when Cedric stood. The courtroom went silent. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Vale, please sit down. You're not recognized. I have something to say." Cedric's voice was calm, almost pleasant, the voice of a man at a dinner party rather than fighting for his life. "And I think everyone here will want to hear it. This is highly irregular. So is a trial where a coward trades testimony for immunity, while the woman who actually orchestrated this entire web of blackmail sits in the gallery pretending to be a victim." Cedric pointed directly at Vivian. "Lady Vivian Ashcombe spent 30 years collecting secrets and using them for profit. She's the one who maintained the ledger. She's the one who blackmailed half of Parliament. I was simply one of her clients." The courtroom erupted. Vivian went pale beside Evelyn, her hands trembling. James swore under his breath. "And that girl," Cedric continued, pointing now at Evelyn, "came to London with a vendetta because her mother was a thief who died stealing from my family. This entire prosecution is built on forged documents, coerced testimony, and the manipulations of a blackmailer desperate to destroy evidence of her own crimes." "Lies," Evelyn shouted, standing. "All lies. Your journal was stolen by someone who had access to my study and plenty of motivation to forge entries." Cedric's smile was terrible. "You really think I'd be stupid enough to document my own crimes? You think a man who survived this long would leave evidence lying around? We have Marcus's testimony from a murderer who will say anything to avoid hanging, who benefits from implicating me because it takes focus off his own actions." Cedric turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I submit that this entire trial is a sham orchestrated by Lady Ashcombe to destroy the people who refuse to pay her blackmail. And these two," he gestured at Evelyn and James, "are her useful idiots." The judge's gavel slammed down repeatedly, trying to restore order as the courtroom descended into chaos. Journalists were running for the doors, desperate to file stories. Spectators were shouting questions. The jury looked confused and overwhelmed. Evelyn felt the ground shifting beneath her, felt the narrative being twisted in real time. Because Cedric was doing what he did best, finding the cracks in truth and prying them open until doubt flooded in. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, trying to salvage control, "we have physical evidence that could have been planted. We have testimony that's contradicted by my client's version of events, and we have significant questions about the motives of everyone involved in this prosecution." The defense attorney had found his footing again, smelling opportunity. "I move for a mistrial based on prosecutorial misconduct and tainted evidence." The judge looked between the defense, the prosecution, the witness box where Marcus sat stone-faced, and the gallery where Evelyn stood with her hands shaking and her world falling apart. "This court is adjourned," he finally said. "I need time to review these allegations. We reconvene in 2 days." The gavel fell, and with it, any illusion that truth was enough. They gathered at the safe house in silence, each processing what had just happened. Cedric had done in 10 minutes what seemed impossible. He'd taken his own guilt and weaponized it into doubt about everyone else. "He's going to walk," Vivian said quietly. "The judge is looking for any excuse to declare a mistrial, and Cedric just handed him a dozen. By next week, this will all be blamed on me, and everyone will go back to believing the aristocracy is fundamentally noble and I'm just a bitter blackmailer. Not if we prove the journal is real." Evelyn was pacing, her mind racing. "There has to be a way to authenticate it. Handwriting analysis, paper dating. Takes months. We have 2 days. James was at the window watching the street, and even if we could prove it's real, he's already planted the seed that you could have forged it. That's all a jury needs for reasonable doubt. Then we need something he can't explain away. Something that proves beyond any question that he ordered those murders." "Like what?" Vivian's voice was hollow. "We've already shown the ledger, the journal, the testimony. We've got bank records and letters and a witness who worked for him for 20 years. What else is there?" The silence that followed was the sound of defeat recognizing itself. Then James spoke, his voice quiet and terrible. "There's one thing he can't explain away. One piece of evidence he can't claim was forged or planted or manipulated." "What?" "A living witness. Someone who saw something directly. Someone whose testimony can't be discredited because they have nothing to gain and everything to lose." "We don't have anyone like that?" Evelyn said. "Yes." James turned to face them. "We do." The look in his eyes made Evelyn's blood run cold. "James, what are you talking about?" "I was there the night Margaret Ward died. I saw what happened." The room seemed to tilt. Evelyn felt her breath catch. "What?" "I was 14 years old, working in the kitchens. I saw Marcus lead your mother up to the North Tower. I saw Cedric Vale meet them there. I heard them arguing, and I watched from the shadows as Cedric gave the order and Marcus pushed her." James's voice cracked. "I watched her fall. Heard her hit, saw them walk away like nothing had happened." "Why didn't you say anything?" Evelyn could barely breathe. "Why didn't you testify before?" "Because I was a child. Because I was terrified. Because Cedric saw me that night, standing in the shadows, and he looked right at me and smiled. Didn't say a word, just smiled. And I knew that if I ever spoke about what I'd seen, I'd follow your mother off that tower." James moved toward her. "So I stayed quiet for 20 years, became invisible, waited for a chance to make it right. You could have told me," and said what? "That I watched your mother die and did nothing? That I'm as guilty as they are because I chose my life over her justice?" James's face was anguished. "I've hated myself every day since. That's why I helped you when you came to the castle. Why I risked everything to get you that study key. I thought maybe if I could help you expose him, it would matter. But it doesn't matter unless I stand up and say what I saw. If you testify, Cedric will know you betrayed him. He'll come after you. He's going to come after all of us anyway. At least this way your mother's death means something." Evelyn felt tears burning her eyes. She thought about her mother, walking into darkness with a killer at her side. She thought about James, 14 years old and traumatized, carrying that weight for 2 decades. She thought about all the lives destroyed because one man believed power meant he could do anything. "Are you sure?" she asked. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The courtroom was even more packed when they reconvened. Word had spread that new testimony was coming, something dramatic enough to change everything. Journalists filled half the gallery. Members of Parliament sat in the back rows. Even Queen Victoria had sent an observer, aware that this trial had become about more than one man's crimes. James Kellerman was called to the stand. He looked smaller there, vulnerable, his hands shaking as he took the oath. The prosecutor approached carefully, sensing the fragility of what they had. "Mr. Kellerman, can you tell the court where you were on the night of November 17th, 1806? "I was working in the kitchens at Blackthorn Castle." James's voice was quiet but steady. "I saw Marcus Dane and Margaret Ward walking toward the North Tower staircase. I followed them." "Why?" "Because Margaret had been kind to me, and I'd overheard Marcus talking about her earlier that day, saying she was a problem that needed solving. I was afraid for her." "What did you see?" James took a deep breath. "I saw them climb to the top of the tower. I stayed in the shadows of the stairwell. Cedric Vale was already there waiting. They argued. Margaret begged for her life, told them she'd kept copies of documents, that killing her wouldn't stop the truth from coming out. And Cedric Vale looked at her and said, word for word, 'Then I'll kill everyone you've ever told, starting with your daughter.'" The courtroom went silent. Every eye turned to Cedric, who sat frozen at the defense table. "And then?" the prosecutor prompted. "Then Marcus pushed her. She screamed as she fell. The sound—" James closed his eyes. "I hear it every night. Why didn't you come forward at the time?" "Because Cedric saw me. As they were leaving, he looked right at me, hiding in the shadows. And he smiled. Didn't say a word, just smiled. And I knew that smile meant I'd die next if I talked. And you're coming forward now despite that risk?" "Yes. Because 20 years is long enough to be a coward." The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have now heard from an eyewitness with no motive to lie. Nothing to gain from this testimony except putting his own life in danger. He saw Cedric Vale order a murder. He watched it happen. And he's finally brave enough to say so." The defense attorney stood, his face desperate. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly a friend of the alleged victim's daughter. His testimony is biased." "I'd never met Evelyn Ward until 3 months ago," James interrupted. "I had no idea she existed. I came forward because I saw her trying to do what I was too afraid to do, and I decided it was time to stop being afraid." The defense attorney looked at Cedric, and what passed between them was the silent communication of a sinking ship and a rat looking for an exit. "The prosecution rests," Blackwood said. The judge looked at Cedric. "Mr. Vale, do you wish to testify in your own defense?" For a long moment, Cedric said nothing. Then he stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the courtroom with absolute clarity. "No. Because this entire proceeding is a farce, and I will not dignify it with my participation. You want to convict me? Go ahead. But know that I am one man in a system I didn't create. I simply learned to navigate, and when I'm gone, someone else will take my place, because this is what power looks like. This is what it's always looked like." He smiled at the jury. "You think you're serving justice? You're just making yourselves feel better about a world that will never change." The judge's gavel slammed down. "The jury is instructed to disregard that statement. Mr. Vale, sit down." But Cedric remained standing, his eyes finding Evelyn's across the courtroom. "I'll see you again," he said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next year. But justice is temporary. Revenge is eternal." Then the guards dragged him down, and the trial that had consumed England for weeks was finally over. The verdict came back in 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. When it was read, Cedric Vale showed no emotion at all. He simply looked at the ceiling as if bored by the proceedings, as if his own execution was just another minor inconvenience in a life full of them. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered. Newspapers printed special editions. Parliament called emergency sessions to discuss reforms. Everyone agreed this was a watershed moment, the day England's aristocracy learned it could no longer act with impunity. But Evelyn felt no joy, only exhaustion. She found James in a tavern 3 blocks from the courthouse, drinking whiskey and looking like a man who'd just survived his own funeral. "Thank you," she said, sitting across from him. "Don't." James didn't look up. "I should have spoken 20 years ago. Your mother would still be alive." "Maybe. Or maybe Cedric would have killed you both and buried the evidence deeper. You can't change the past. No, but you carry it with you anyway. They sat in silence, two people who'd survived something that would mark them forever. Eventually, Vivian joined them, looking older and more fragile than Evelyn had ever seen her. "The prosecutor wants to speak with me tomorrow," Vivian said quietly. "About my role in the blackmail network. About charges. Will they prosecute? Probably. I broke laws, lots of them. The fact that I helped bring down Cedric doesn't erase that." She smiled without humor. "Turns out there's no such thing as a clean escape. What will you do?" "Face it. Testify honestly. Accept whatever punishment comes." Vivian looked at Evelyn. "I spent 30 years running from consequences. I'm tired." That night, alone in her room at Blackthorn Castle, Evelyn read her mother's final letter one more time. She thought about justice and revenge and the space between them. She thought about how victory felt like ashes when you understood the cost. And she thought about Cedric's final words. Revenge is eternal. Because even with him sentenced to death, even with his empire dismantled and his crimes exposed, she knew this wasn't over. Someone out there was angry about what she'd done. Someone powerful who'd lost money or status or reputation because of the Ledger's revelations. Someone who would decide that Evelyn Ward needed to be made an example of. The knock on her door came at midnight. When she opened it, she found Thomas Webb standing there with a face carved from grief. "They took my grandson," he said. "Left a note saying this is payment for my testimony. That reform has a price." The letter dropped from Evelyn's hand. Behind Thomas, she could see James running up the stairs, his face pale. "It started," James said. 3 fires in the tenant district, homes of people who supported the reforms, and a message delivered to Lady Margaret's house threatening her grandchildren. Evelyn felt something inside her break and reform into something harder. All the idealism, all the belief that exposing truth would fix everything, all the naive hope that justice mattered, it shattered like glass and left something cold and sharp in its place. "They're trying to teach us a lesson," she said quietly. "Trying to show us that even winning doesn't matter if they can still hurt us." "So what do we do?" Thomas's voice was raw. "Surrender? Let them win?" Evelyn looked between them. These men who'd risked everything because she'd convinced them change was possible. She thought about her mother, who'd believed the same thing and died for it. She thought about every person who'd ever tried to stand against power and been crushed. And she made a choice that would define everything that came after. "No," she said, "we don't surrender, and we don't play by their rules anymore. They want to show us that power means you can hurt people without consequences? Then we show them what happens when the powerless decide consequences don't matter anymore." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we burn it all down. Every estate, every title, every structure that allows men like Cedric to exist. We don't reform the system. We destroy it completely and build something new from the ashes. That's revolution." "Yes." Evelyn's voice was cold as winter. "It is." James and Thomas looked at each other, and in that moment, 3 people crossed a line they could never uncross. They stopped being reformers trying to fix a broken system. They became revolutionaries determined to smash it into pieces. Outside, London slept, unaware that the trial everyone thought had ended was just the opening move in a war that would reshape an empire. And in his cell, Cedric Vale lay awake and smiled, because chaos was exactly what he'd wanted all along. The revolution began with fire. Not the grand kind that burns in history books, but the small flames that catch in tenant cottages when men with torches decide fear is a currency they can spend forever. Evelyn stood on the castle ramparts at dawn and watched smoke rise from 3 different villages, each one a message written in ash and screaming, "This is what happens when you challenge power." "They're burning people alive," James said beside her, his voice flat with rage. "Women and children. Families who did nothing but vote for reduced rents. How many dead? 17 confirmed. Maybe more in the rubble." Evelyn's hands gripped the stone wall hard enough to hurt. She thought about reform, about justice, about the naive belief that exposing corruption would somehow fix a system designed to protect the corrupt. She'd been a fool. You couldn't negotiate with predators. You could only become something they feared more. Thomas Webb appeared behind them, his face gray with exhaustion. "The tenant farmers are arming themselves. Every man who can hold a weapon is ready. But we need a target. We need to know who ordered this. We know who, Evelyn said quietly. Everyone who lost money when the ledger went public. Every noble whose reputation we destroyed. Every judge and official we exposed. They formed a coalition. A coalition against what? Reform? James's laugh was bitter. They're terrorizing civilians because we dared suggest that maybe starving people shouldn't pay 70% of their crops to fund wine cellars and hunting parties. They're terrorizing civilians because it works. Evelyn turned to face them both. Fear is how they've maintained control for centuries. And as long as people believe that resistance means watching their families burn, nothing changes. So what's the plan? Make them more afraid? Thomas's voice carried the weight of a man who'd buried his daughter 3 days ago and would bury his neighbors today. How do we do that without becoming exactly what we're fighting? The question hung in the cold morning air like an indictment. Because that was the trap, wasn't it? You either stayed moral and got crushed, or you embraced brutality and became the monster you'd set out to destroy. There was no clean path forward. There never had been. We hit them where it matters most, Evelyn said slowly, the plan forming even as she spoke. Not their estates or their titles. Their money. Everything they own is stored in 3 banks in London. We expose which accounts hold stolen wealth. We turn their own greed against them. And if they retaliate by burning more villages, then we make sure they don't have resources to pay the men who set the fires. Every revolution is funded by someone. We cut off the funding. We cut off their ability to wage this war. You're talking about destroying the entire financial system, James said. The banks will fight back. The crown will intervene. Good. Let them. Let everyone see exactly how much effort the powerful will spend protecting stolen money versus protecting human lives. Evelyn's voice was cold and certain now, shaped by necessity into something that frightened her when she heard it. We stop playing defense. We stop reacting. We become the threat they can't ignore. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been respect or horror, or both. You've changed. 3 months ago you wanted justice. Now you want blood. No. I want what I've always wanted, for people to live without being crushed by the weight of someone else's greed. But I've learned that asking nicely doesn't work, that presenting evidence doesn't work, that even convicting murderers doesn't work if the system they built survives them. She met his eyes. So yes, I've changed, because the world taught me that mercy is just another word for weakness in a game where only predators survive. And if this turns you into Cedric Vale, if you become exactly what you hate, then at least people will eat while I'm terrorizing them. Bahati. The plan required precision, allies in places they didn't have, and luck they couldn't count on, which meant it was perfect for 3 people who'd already lost everything that mattered and had nothing but rage left to spend. Evelyn sat in the castle library surrounded by financial documents that James had stolen from a solicitor's office using methods he refused to explain. The numbers told a story uglier than she'd imagined. Systematic theft spanning decades. Entire fortunes built on tenant starvation, investment schemes that funneled public funds into private accounts, and 3 banks that held it all, Barclays, Coutts, and Rothschild. Different institutions, same function, protecting wealth that should never have existed. Lady Margaret entered with tea she'd prepared herself, not trusting servants anymore after 2 attempts to poison the castle's water supply. She looked older than her 70 years, worn down by threats against her grandchildren and the weight of nobility turning against her. You're planning something dangerous, she said, setting the tea service down with shaking hands. Everything's dangerous now. Evelyn didn't look up from the documents. They've made certain of that. Then let me help. I still have connections, people who remember my husband, who owe favors. We can... No. Evelyn finally met her eyes. You've done enough. You've risked enough. If this fails, I need someone left alive to tell the story. And if it succeeds? If you actually manage to dismantle the financial system and bring down the nobility? What then? Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Chaos fills power vacuums. You destroy one empire, another rises, usually worse than the first. Maybe, but at least it won't be this empire. At least it won't be built on centuries of accumulated cruelty dressed up as tradition. Margaret sat down heavily. You sound like the revolutionaries in France. They promised liberation too. How many heads rolled before they realized blood doesn't build, it only destroys? The French aristocracy still exists, Evelyn said flatly. They learned nothing, changed nothing. The poor still starve while the rich debate which wine pairs with venison. If the only lesson people learn from revolutions is to hide their corruption better, then maybe we didn't cut deep enough. James burst through the door without knocking, his face urgent. We have a problem. Marcus Dane escaped custody last night. The words landed like a physical blow. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. How? Someone inside the prison system. Guards were bribed or threatened or both. He's gone. And given that he knows everything about everyone, he'll go straight to whoever's funding the counterattack, Evelyn finished. He'll offer his services in exchange for protection. And suddenly our enemies have a professional killer who knows exactly how we think. Worse. James moved to the window, scanning the grounds with military precision. He knows this castle, every entrance, every weakness, every hidden passage. If they want you dead, he's the perfect weapon. Then we leave, pack what matters, and disappear before— No. Evelyn stood, decision crystallizing even as fear tried to paralyze her. We stay. We execute the plan, and we set a trap for Marcus that he won't see coming. What kind of trap? The kind that uses his greatest strength against him. Evelyn moved to the map of London spread across the library table. Marcus is a professional. He plans. He watches. He waits for the perfect moment. So we give him what looks like the perfect moment, and when he takes it, we end him. You're talking about using yourself as bait. I'm talking about finishing what my mother started 20 years ago. She tried to expose corruption through proper channels and died for it. I won't make the same mistake. Evelyn's finger traced a route on the map. 3 banks. 3 simultaneous strikes. We divide their attention, force them to protect multiple targets, and while they're scrambling, we hit the real objective, which is? Thomas had entered during the conversation, his clothes still smelling of smoke from helping survivors. The Crown's financial records, everything they've hidden about royal investments in the slave trade, in colonial exploitation, in domestic theft dressed as taxation. We prove that corruption goes all the way to the top, that the entire system is rotten. She looked around at them, and then we publish it everywhere simultaneously so they can't suppress it. That's treason, Margaret whispered. Yes, it is. Evelyn's voice was steady. And when this is over, I'll probably hang for it. But at least the truth will be out there. At least people will know exactly what they're supporting every time they bow to a crown bought with blood money. The silence that followed was the sound of people recognizing there was no path back from this, that they'd crossed into territory where survival meant victory and failure meant death, with no middle ground for compromise or surrender. When do we move? James asked. Tomorrow night, during the gala at Buckingham Palace. Every person who matters will be there. Security will be focused on protecting nobles, not banks. Evelyn began rolling up the documents. We have one chance. If we fail, they'll hunt down everyone connected to the reform movement and make examples that'll terrify people for generations. And if we succeed, then we change everything, or die trying. The preparation took 18 hours of work that felt like 18 years. James recruited former soldiers who'd come home from colonial wars to find their pensions stolen and their service forgotten. Thomas gathered tenant farmers who'd lost children to starvation while watching grain shipped to London for export. Vivian, facing her own trial in 2 weeks, contributed names of people she'd blackmailed who might be willing to turn traitor for revenge. They were an army of the desperate, the broken, and the furious. Perfect. Evelyn spent the hours before dawn writing letters to be delivered if she died. One to Lady Margaret, thanking her for believing in reform. One to Thomas Webb, apologizing for the cost of hope. And one to her mother, words she'd never been able to say, pouring onto paper like a confession or a prayer to something she wasn't sure existed. I understand now why you did it. Why you walked into that castle knowing they might kill you. Because some injustices are so massive that staying silent becomes its own form of violence. Because there are moments when a single person's courage matters more than their survival. You taught me that. And I'm sorry it took me so long to learn. James found her as the first light touched the horizon. He looked different in black clothes meant for stealth, his face hard with the expression of someone who'd killed before and would kill again. The teams are in position. 3 banks, 3 groups. We move at midnight when the palace gala peaks. Guards will be drunk or distracted. He paused. There's still time to call this off. No, there isn't. Evelyn folded the letters and placed them in envelopes. We passed that point when they started burning children alive. I'm not talking about tactical concerns. I'm talking about you. About whether you're ready for what comes after. Because if we do this, if we actually pull it off, you become the face of revolution, the person every loyalist wants dead, the symbol that terrifies the powerful. Good. Let them be terrified for once. Evelyn. James moved closer, his voice dropping. I've seen what war does to people, how it hollows them out until there's nothing left but the fight. Don't let this consume you so completely that you forget why we started. I remember perfectly. We started because my mother died trying to save people who didn't even know they needed saving. We're finishing it because those same people are dying anyway, while the powerful debate how much cruelty is acceptable. She met his eyes. I haven't forgotten why we fight. I've just learned that winning requires becoming someone I never wanted to be. What if you can't come back from that? Then I don't. But at least I'll have mattered. James studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Pain mixed with understanding, mixed with the kind of resignation that came from recognizing there was no argument that would change her mind. Your mother would be proud of you. Or terrified. Maybe both. Probably both. Evelyn smiled without humor. I'm terrified of me, and I'm the one making these decisions. They stood together as dawn broke over Blackthorn Castle, watching light touch the grounds where her mother had died 2 decades ago. Somewhere in London, Marcus Dane was preparing to hunt her. Somewhere in the palace, nobles were dressing for a gala that would become a massacre of reputations. Somewhere in 3 banks, documents waited that would reshape England's understanding of itself. And somewhere in a prison cell, Cedric Vale sat awaiting execution, smiling because he'd achieved exactly what he wanted. Chaos that would outlive him. Plus, the palace gala was everything Evelyn had imagined and nothing she'd expected. Chandeliers that cost more than villages. Gowns that represented years of labor by underpaid seamstresses. Food piled on tables while people starved within sight of the palace walls. It was obscenity dressed in elegance, and everyone pretended not to notice. She moved through the crowd wearing a stolen invitation and a dress that Vivian had provided, playing the role of minor nobility well enough that no one looked twice. Around her, the powerful laughed and gossiped and made deals that would impact thousands of lives decided over champagne and small talk. Lady Vivian appeared at her elbow, looking dangerous in crimson silk. Last chance to reconsider this insanity. You came. Someone has to watch you do something spectacularly stupid. Might as well be me. Vivian's smile was sharp. Besides, I'm already facing prison for my role in the ledger. Might as well earn the punishment. Where's Thomas? Positioned at Barclays with 15 men who know how to crack a safe, James is hitting Coots with another team. And a third group I barely trust is targeting Rothschild. We're coordinated on timing. Midnight, when everyone here is too drunk to notice London burning. The Crown's records? In a vault beneath the palace. Accessed through the wine cellar. Vivian produced a key that looked ancient. Stolen from the royal steward's office last week. One of the benefits of blackmailing people. You acquire interesting items. They moved through the ballroom, 2 women invisible among hundreds, their purpose hidden behind smiles and small talk. Evelyn caught glimpses of faces she recognized from the trial. Judges who'd ruled in Cedric's favor, officials who'd taken bribes, nobles who'd threatened her family. All of them here, celebrating their own survival while the country they'd corrupted burned outside. She felt rage settle in her bones like ice. Not the hot fury that passed quickly, but cold calculation that planned and measured and waited for the perfect moment to strike. At 11:30, they slipped away from the gala, moving through servant corridors with the confidence of people who belonged. Down marble stairs, through kitchens where staff worked frantically, into cellars that smelled of wine and rot and old violence. The vault door was smaller than expected, hidden behind racks of bottles that hadn't been touched in decades. Vivian's key turned smoothly, and the door opened into darkness that felt heavy with secrets. Evelyn lit a candle stolen from the kitchen. The light revealed a small room lined with shelves holding ledgers and documents that represented centuries of royal crime. She began pulling them systematically, checking dates and titles, loading them into bags they'd brought. Here, She held up a leather-bound volume. Investments in the Atlantic slave trade. Direct royal involvement. Names, dates, profits. This alone could... Footsteps echoed in the cellar above. They both froze. The steps were purposeful, military, moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Vivian's hand went to the knife concealed in her dress. Evelyn grabbed as many documents as she could carry. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. "Miss Ward," a voice called down. "I know you're there. I've been watching you all night, waiting for you to make your move." Marcus Dane descended into view, holding a pistol that looked well-maintained and frequently used. Behind him came three men with the faces of professional killers, the kind who'd spent years learning how to hurt people efficiently. "You're predictable," Marcus continued, moving closer. "Cedric said you would be. Said you'd go for the big gesture, the dramatic revelation. He was right about everything. Cedric's about to hang. Is he?" Marcus smiled. "There are riots in 3 districts. Parliament's dissolved into chaos. The king's considering martial law. In that kind of confusion, prisoners escape. Judges disappear. Trials get forgotten. Cedric understands something you don't. Order is fragile. You break it enough, people beg for anyone who promises to restore it, even monsters. You're working for him. Even now. I'm working for whoever pays best. Right now that's a coalition of nobles who really want you dead. Lucky me, your head's worth enough to retire on." Marcus raised the pistol. "Nothing personal, just business." The explosion that shook the palace came from the direction of Barclays Bank. Then another from Coots. Then a third from Rothschild. 3 simultaneous blasts that rattled wine bottles and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Marcus's attention flickered for just a second toward the sound. In that second, Vivian threw her knife with precision born from 30 years of survival. It took Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him around. His pistol discharged, the shot going wild, echoing in the confined space like thunder. Evelyn didn't think. She grabbed the nearest bottle, something old and expensive, and brought it down on the skull of the closest attacker. Glass shattered, wine and blood mixed. The man went down hard. Vivian was already moving, her dress hiked up, revealing a second knife strapped to her thigh. She met the second attacker with the kind of vicious efficiency that came from decades of being underestimated, cutting low and fast, dropping him before he understood the danger. But Marcus was recovering, his left hand now holding the pistol, his right hanging useless. He aimed at Evelyn with the calm of a professional who'd missed once and wouldn't miss again. James came through the vault door like a storm, tackling Marcus from behind. They crashed into the shelves, years of royal documentation cascading around them. The pistol skittered across stone floor. Evelyn dove for it. Her fingers closed around metal that felt warm from recent firing. She turned, aimed at Marcus, who was grappling with James, both men fighting with the desperate intensity of people who understood only one of them would leave this cellar alive. She couldn't get a clear shot. They were too close, moving too fast, locked together in violence that was almost intimate in its brutality. Then Marcus broke free, his good hand finding a broken bottle, bringing it up toward James's throat with the speed of someone who'd done this before. Evelyn fired. The sound was impossibly loud in the confined space. Marcus jerked backward, a red flower blooming on his chest. He looked down at it with something like surprise, then up at Evelyn with something like respect. "Your mother," he said, blood bubbling between his words. "Never had the stomach for this. Guess you're different." Then he collapsed, and the man who'd killed Margaret Ward and 17 others died in a wine cellar beneath the palace where he'd served for 20 years. James stood slowly, breathing hard, blood on his face, but none of it his. "You all right?" "No." Evelyn's hands were shaking, the pistol suddenly impossibly heavy. "But we need to move. The explosions will bring guards." They grabbed what documents they could carry and ran. London was burning when they emerged. Not the controlled fires of the initial attacks, but real chaos. Angry crowds responding to the bank explosions, guards trying to restore order, revolutionaries using the confusion to settle old scores. The gala had dissolved into panic, nobles fleeing in carriages while their security detail fought running battles in the streets. Evelyn, James, and Vivian made it 3 blocks before they were surrounded. Not by guards, by people. Hundreds of them, filling the street, blocking every exit. Tenant farmers who'd traveled from Blackthorn, workers from London factories, servants who'd left their positions, all of them carrying torches or weapons or nothing but their fury. For a terrifying moment, Evelyn thought they'd come for blood. That revolution had consumed itself. That mob violence would swallow everyone regardless of allegiance. Then Thomas Webb pushed through the crowd, his face grim but determined. We hit all 3 banks. Got the documents. Every stolen fortune, every corrupt transaction, every crime hidden in ledgers. It's all coming out. He held up papers that glowed in the firelight. And we made sure copies went to every newspaper, every foreign correspondent, every person who might print truth. The Crown's records? Evelyn held up her own stolen documents. Everything they've hidden, everything they've profited from while people starved. Then we won? Someone in the crowd shouted. No. Evelyn's voice carried across the street, silencing hundreds. We survived the first battle. Now comes the war. Because exposing corruption doesn't end it. It just forces it into the light where everyone has to choose, accept that the system is broken beyond repair or fight to maintain it despite knowing what it costs. The crowd was silent, waiting. These were people who'd lost everything, who had nothing but hope that maybe, finally, something might change. They were dangerous and desperate and looking for someone to tell them what came next. Evelyn thought about her mother, about Cedric, about every person who died because the powerful refused to release their grip on a world that was killing everyone beneath them. She thought about justice and revenge and the space between them that she'd spent 3 months trying to navigate. And she made the choice that would define whether she was a reformer or a revolutionary. We don't stop, she said. We push until the whole structure collapses. Every noble who stole, every official who took bribes, every judge who ruled for money instead of law. We name them all. We make their crimes impossible to ignore. And we don't stop until England chooses. Equality or empire, justice or tradition, people or power. The crowd roared. The sound was terrifying and exhilarating and final. There would be no going back from this. No negotiating with power, no compromise with corruption. Just the brutal simplicity of total war between those who had everything and those who had nothing left to lose. James grabbed her arm. We need to move. The military's being mobilized. By dawn, this will be an actual war zone. Then we make sure we're ready for war. They disappeared into the crowd, carried by a tide of rage and hope and desperation that would either reshape England or burn it to ash. Behind them, the palace glowed with fire from a dozen different sources. And somewhere in the chaos, the old order was dying while something new and terrible struggled to be born. In his cell, Cedric Vale heard the explosions and smiled. Let them burn it all, he thought. Let them tear down everything. Because empires built on ashes always need someone who understands violence. And when the chaos finally settled, when the revolutionaries realized that destruction was easier than construction, they'd come looking for someone who knew how to rule through fear. He could wait. Patience was just another form of power, and Cedric Vale was nothing if not patient. Dawn came gray and cold over London. The fires had been contained but not extinguished. 3 banks lay in ruins. The palace was damaged but standing. And across the city, people woke to newspapers that spelled out in brutal detail exactly how corrupt their leaders had been for centuries. The king's response came at noon: martial law, a curfew, arrest warrants for everyone involved in what he called a terrorist attack on England's financial stability. Evelyn Ward's name was at the top of the list. She stood in a safe house on the edge of London, surrounded by stolen documents and exhausted revolutionaries, and read the warrant that made her officially an enemy of the state. £1,000 for information leading to her capture, $5,000 for her alive, $10,000 for proof of her death. I'm worth more dead than alive, she said to no one in particular. That feels like commentary. Thomas Webb sat nearby, cleaning a rifle with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. They're coming for all of us. Everyone who helped. Everyone who supported reform. They'll make examples. Let them try. James was at the window again, always watching. We've got support now. Real support. People are rioting in 12 cities. Parliament's deadlocked. The military's refusing orders in 3 districts because the soldiers are mostly tenant farmers' sons who've read what their families were subjected to. That won't last, Vivian said quietly. Fear will bring them back in line. It always does. Not this time. Evelyn felt certainty settle over her like armor. This time, we've shown people that the powerful bleed, that they can be hurt, that their strength is an illusion maintained only as long as everyone agrees to believe it. Once that illusion breaks, it never fully repairs. So what now? Thomas set down the rifle. We're fugitives. The entire government wants us dead. How do we fight an empire? The same way empires have always been destroyed. Evelyn moved to the table where maps of England were spread out like prophecy. We make them choose between maintaining control and maintaining legitimacy. Every act of violence they commit to suppress us costs them credibility. Every innocent they arrest proves we were right about corruption. They can win through brutality, but they can't win without showing the world exactly what they are. That's a long game. People will die. People are already dying, have been dying for centuries. At least now they'll die fighting for something instead of starving quietly for nothing. The room fell silent. Outside, London moved through its morning routines with military patrols replacing constables, fear replacing normalcy. This was the moment revolutions either crystallized into movements or shattered into chaos. The moment when people decided whether to push forward or retreat back into safety. Evelyn looked around at the faces watching her, farmers and soldiers, and a blackmailer turned ally, all of them exhausted and terrified and waiting for someone to tell them the suffering would mean something. She thought about her mother, about that letter she'd written in the hours before dawn, about how a single person's courage could matter more than their survival. And she understood, finally, what her mother had known 20 years ago. Some fights were worth dying for. Some truths were worth any cost to expose. Some moments demanded that you become larger than yourself, even if it meant being crushed by the weight of what you carried. Tomorrow, she said quietly, we take this to Parliament. We walk through those doors with every stolen document, every piece of evidence, every proof of corruption, and we demand they choose reform or revolution, justice or war. They'll arrest you the moment you enter, probably. But they'll have to do it in front of every journalist, every foreign observer, every person watching to see if England has any honor left. They can silence me, but they can't silence what we've already released. The truth is out there now. They can only choose how they respond to it. That's not a plan. That's suicide. No. Evelyn met his eyes. It's what my mother tried to do 20 years ago. Walk into power and demand it account for itself. She died before anyone listened. But I won't be alone. I'll have documentation, witnesses, an entire movement behind me, and most importantly, I'll have already shown them that I'm willing to burn everything if they don't listen. James moved from the window, his face serious. If you do this, you understand you're giving them a target? That everything we've built gets focused down to one person they can blame and destroy? Yes. And you're doing it anyway? Someone has to. And I'm the daughter of a woman they murdered for asking questions. I'm the symbol whether I want to be or not. Might as well use it. The decision settled over the room like snow, cold and quiet and inevitable. They would make their stand in the daylight, in front of witnesses, forcing England to decide what kind of nation it wanted to be. It was insane, reckless, likely to end in arrest or assassination or both. It was perfect. As plans were made and positions decided and weapons checked, Evelyn found herself alone for a moment with the letter she'd written. She picked up the one addressed to her mother and read it one last time. Then she burned it, watching paper curl and blacken and turn to ash that would never reach its destination, because the dead didn't read letters, and the living had to speak for themselves. Tomorrow she would walk into Parliament and demand justice, or offer war. Tonight she would sleep like someone already dead, dreaming of a world where power answered to truth instead of the other way around. And somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Dane's body lay cooling in a morgue, while Cedric Vale waited in his cell, both men proof that violence was the language empires understood best. The question was whether England would learn to speak something else, or whether the only answer to centuries of cruelty was the same cruelty turned back on itself, until nothing remained but ash and the possibility of building something better from the ruins. Dawn would tell. Parliament stood like a monument to centuries of decisions made by men who believed their bloodlines exempted them from consequence. Evelyn Ward climbed its stone steps at dawn with stolen documents in her arms and the weight of revolution pressing against her spine. Behind her, a crowd had gathered despite the curfew, despite the soldiers, despite every threat the crown could manufacture. Hundreds at first, then thousands, filling the street until the military presence looked less like enforcement and more like besiegement. James walked beside her, his hand never far from the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Thomas Webb flanked her other side, moving with the slow determination of a man who'd buried too many children to fear his own death. Vivian brought up the rear, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral, which perhaps she was. The guards at the entrance stepped forward, muskets raised, their young faces uncertain beneath their helmets. Evelyn stopped 3 feet away and waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of the crowd behind her and the distant tolling of church bells marking the hour. "Move aside," she said quietly, "or shoot me in front of 10,000 witnesses and prove everything we've said about your masters." The soldiers looked at each other. One of them couldn't have been more than 18, his hand shaking on his weapon. Behind him, an officer appeared, older and harder, his face carved from disappointment and duty. "Miss Ward, you're under arrest for terrorism, destruction of property, and sedition against the crown. Surrender now, and you'll receive a fair trial." "Like Cedric Vale received? Like my mother received?" Evelyn's voice carried across the steps, pitched for the crowd. "We're done with your version of fairness. We're done with trials where judges are bought and evidence is ignored. Today, you listen to truth, or you kill me for speaking it. Your choice." The officer's jaw tightened. He understood the trap. Arrest her and make her a martyr. Let her speak and risk the contagion of her words spreading. Either way, control was slipping through fingers that had held it for generations. Before he could decide, the Parliament doors opened. Lord Chancellor Pemberton emerged, flanked by a dozen members who'd somehow maintained their positions despite the revelations. He was 70 years old and looked every day of it, his body bent by the weight of maintaining an empire that consumed everything it touched. "Let her speak," he said, his voice thin and tired. "Let's have this finished one way or another." Evelyn climbed the remaining steps and entered the hall where laws had been written to protect power disguised as order. The chamber was half empty, many seats abandoned by men who'd fled London or been arrested or simply refused to show their faces now that everyone knew what they'd done. But enough remained, enough to hear, enough to decide. She moved to the center of the floor, surrounded by wood and stone that had witnessed centuries of decisions that shaped lives they'd never see. She set the documents down on the table reserved for evidence and looked up at the tiers of seats where England's leadership sat in judgment. 20 years ago, she began, my mother walked into Blackthorn Castle with proof that Cedric Vale was stealing from his own family. She believed that showing truth to power would result in justice. Instead, she was murdered and her death called an accident. Because that's how this system works. Truth doesn't matter unless the powerful decide it does. "We are not here to relitigate old crimes," Pemberton interrupted. "If you have evidence relevant to... I have evidence that the Crown profited from the slave trade for decades after abolition was law. That 3 sitting judges took bribes totaling over £50,000. That the banks we're told are too important to fail exist primarily to hide stolen wealth." Evelyn's voice was steel-wrapped in ice. "I have documentation of systematic theft, murder, and corruption spanning 50 years. And I have one question for everyone in this room. What are you going to do about it?" The chamber erupted, shouting from the remaining members, some defending their actions, some calling for her arrest, some demanding to see the evidence. Through it all, Pemberton sat silent, his face unreadable, his hands folded on the desk before him like a man at prayer. "Order," he finally said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We will review Miss Ward's documentation, but I remind this body that presenting evidence obtained through illegal means is the only way anyone ever sees truth in a system designed to bury it," Evelyn finished. "You can arrest me after. Charge me with every crime you can manufacture. But first, you'll look at what I brought. You'll read the names of everyone who profited from suffering, and you'll decide if England wants to be an empire built on theft or a nation accountable to its people." She turned and walked toward the exit. Every step felt like walking through water, her body heavy with exhaustion and the kind of fear that came after adrenaline faded. But she kept moving, kept her spine straight, refused to show weakness to men who'd spent their lives exploiting it. "Miss Ward," Pemberton called after her. "Where do you think you're going?" "To wait for your decision. You know where to find me. You understand you'll be arrested the moment you step outside?" "Then I'll be arrested. But those documents stay here. and the copies we distributed stay in circulation. The truth is out. The only question is whether you'll acknowledge it or spend the rest of your careers pretending you didn't know. She walked through the doors and into morning light that felt too bright after the chamber's darkness. The crowd roared when they saw her, a sound like an ocean breaking against rocks. Soldiers moved forward to arrest her, their faces grim with duty and maybe a little relief that someone else had made the decision. James stepped between her and the approaching guards, his hand now openly on his pistol. "You'll have to go through all of us." "Stand down," the officer commanded. "This woman is under arrest by order of—" The explosion that shattered the moment came not from the crowd or the soldiers, but from inside Parliament itself. A dull thump that rattled windows, followed by screams and smoke billowing from the chamber they'd just left. Evelyn spun around, horror washing through her. She hadn't planted explosives, hadn't ordered violence. This wasn't part of any plan. Thomas grabbed her arm. "We need to move, now. But people are dead or dying, and you standing here won't change it. We move or we all die." They ran, the crowd scattering in panic, soldiers abandoning arrest to respond to the attack. Behind them, Parliament burned, black smoke rising into gray sky like a prophecy written in ash. Quote, "The safe house felt like a tomb when they finally reached it 3 hours later." Evelyn sat at the table with her head in her hands while James paced and Vivian stared at nothing, and Thomas cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision that suggested he'd given up on anything but preparing for the next fight. 18 dead, James said, reading from a newspaper someone had managed to acquire. 40 wounded. They're calling it a terrorist attack. Saying we did it. We didn't, Evelyn said, but her voice lacked conviction, because they hadn't done this specific thing, but they'd created the chaos that made it possible. They'd lit the fuse and walked away pretending they could control the explosion. Doesn't matter what we did or didn't do. Vivian's voice was hollow. Public opinion just turned. We went from freedom fighters to murderers in one moment. Everything we exposed will be buried under outrage about the bombing. Who actually did it? Thomas looked up from his rifle. Because someone set that charge. Someone who wanted this to look like us. The answer arrived an hour later in the form of a message delivered by a street urchin who ran before anyone could question him. The note was written in elegant script on expensive paper. Thank you for the chaos. It's exactly what I needed. The king has declared martial law and suspended parliament indefinitely. I've been released from prison to assist with security during the crisis, given my extensive knowledge of criminal networks. Congratulations, Miss Ward. You've made me indispensable. Regards, Cedric Vale. Evelyn read it 3 times, each pass stripping away another layer of hope. She'd been played, used. Cedric had understood from the beginning that revolution would create exactly the kind of chaos that made people desperate for order at any cost. And who better to restore order than a man who understood chaos intimately? He's won, she whispered. Everything we did, everyone who died, it was all just moving pieces on a board he controlled. No. James took the note from her hands. He's free, but he's not safe. The evidence is still out there. The truth is still exposed. He might have engineered this crisis, but he hasn't erased what we revealed. Doesn't matter if no one believes it. Vivian stood and moved to the window, looking out at a London transformed by fear into something that would accept any master who promised safety. That's the brilliance of it. He didn't suppress the truth. He just made it irrelevant by creating something more immediate to fear. The room fell silent. Outside, military patrols moved through streets empty of civilians. The curfew had been extended indefinitely. Anyone caught outside faced immediate arrest or worse. England had transformed overnight into the kind of authoritarian state that history books condemned when it happened elsewhere. And Evelyn understood, finally, what her mother had faced 20 years ago. The same choice. Fight and watch everything you love burn, or surrender and let injustice continue uninterrupted. There was no third option. There never had been. What do we do? Thomas asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn thought about Cedric's smile, about Marcus lying dead in a wine cellar, about her mother broken on stones because she dared to ask questions. She thought about all the people who died believing change was possible, and all the people who would die if nothing changed. And she understood that winning wasn't the same as surviving, that sometimes victory meant lighting a fire even if you burned in it, because the light it created allowed others to see clearly for the first time. "We finish what we started," she said quietly. "We find Cedric Vale and we end him, not for revenge, not for justice, but because as long as he lives, he's a symbol that corruption survives everything, and symbols matter. He'll be protected now. Guards everywhere, probably living in the palace under royal protection." James's voice was steady, despite the impossibility he was outlining. "Getting to him means going through an army. Then we go through an army, or we find another way. But we don't stop. We don't surrender. We push until something breaks." Evelyn stood, decision crystallizing. "And if it's us that breaks, at least we broke fighting. That's not a plan. That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's the only option that doesn't involve watching everything we've accomplished get erased, while Cedric Vale turns this country into his personal empire." The silence that followed was the sound of people recognizing they'd crossed past the point where survival mattered more than purpose. They were revolutionaries now, all the way down, and revolutionaries either won or died. There was no comfortable middle ground. Cedric Vale stood in what had once been the Lord Chancellor's office and was now his by royal appointment. Security advisor to the crown during times of crisis, a title that came with sweeping powers and minimal oversight. It was perfect. Everything he'd worked toward for 20 years, achieved not despite being exposed but because of it. The explosion had been simple to arrange. A few loyalists who understood that chaos served their interests. A bomb placed where it would kill enough people to justify extreme measures, but not so many that foreign powers would intervene. Just enough blood to make the public beg for someone to restore order. And who better than a man who understood criminals intimately, who'd already been accused of being one himself, so no one would be surprised when he used brutal methods to restore peace. He looked out at London burning in a dozen different places and felt something close to satisfaction. This was order constructed from chaos, control earned through violence. The world as it actually was, stripped of the pretty lies people told themselves about justice and fairness and moral progress. "Your Grace," an aide appeared in the doorway. "We've located the ward girl's safe house. Security forces are preparing to move." "No." Cedric turned from the window. "Let her come to me. She will, eventually. She's too much like her mother. Too convinced that courage matters more than strategy. And if she doesn't, then we make her. But I suspect we won't have to. People like Evelyn Ward, they can't help themselves. They see injustice, and they have to fight it, even when fighting is suicide. It's both their greatest strength and their fatal flaw." The aide left, and Cedric returned to the window, watching smoke rise and thinking about empires built on the bones of idealists who believed right made might. History was littered with people like Evelyn Ward, brave, foolish, convinced their suffering would mean something. They were always wrong. Suffering was just suffering. It meant nothing unless you were alive to weaponize it. 3 days later, the message arrived at the safe house, delivered not by an urchin or a stranger, but by Lady Margaret Sinclair herself, looking ancient and defeated as she handed Evelyn an envelope sealed with wax. "He sent this through channels he knew I'd hear about. Wants you to know where he is." Margaret's voice shook. "It's a trap, child. Everyone knows it's a trap." Evelyn opened the envelope and read the single sentence written inside. "Blackthorn Castle. Midnight. Come alone, or watch it burn with everyone inside." "He's taken hostages?" James read over her shoulder. "How many?" "All the servants who remained after the Duke died. 30 people, maybe more." Margaret's hands twisted together. "He's had them locked in the Great Hall for 2 days. Says if you don't come, he'll execute one every hour until you do." "Then I go." "The hell you do," James said flatly. "It's a trap. You walk in there, you die. And if I don't, 30 people die because they worked at a castle where I tried to start a revolution." Evelyn's voice was calm despite the fear clawing at her throat. "We don't get to choose between good options. We choose between bad and worse. What if going is worse? What if he kills you in them anyway? Then at least I'll die trying to save them instead of hiding while they're executed for my choices." Vivian spoke for the first time in hours, her voice distant. "Your mother made this choice. Walked into danger to save people. It didn't work. I know. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some choices are worth making even when they fail. Evelyn looked around at them, these people who'd become family through shared trauma and desperate purpose. I'm not asking anyone to come with me. This is my decision. Like hell it is. James checked his pistol with the automatic competence of someone who'd made peace with violence. You go, I go. Thomas stood without speaking, his rifle already loaded. Vivian sighed and produced a knife from somewhere within her dress. Well, we've committed treason, murdered government officials, and destroyed half of London's financial infrastructure. Might as well add suicide to the list. The decision settled over them like armor. They would walk into Cedric's trap, because not walking meant surrendering the last piece of humanity that made them different from the monsters they fought. It was stupid and noble, and likely to get them killed. It was perfect. Blackthorn Castle looked different in moonlight, its Gothic towers stark against the sky like teeth in a skull's grin. The windows were dark, except for the great hall where candlelight flickered and shadows moved behind glass that reflected nothing but the night's judgment. They approached on foot, leaving their horses a mile back, moving through grounds that Evelyn had walked 100 times, when this place still felt like sanctuary instead of a grave waiting to be filled. Every step brought memories. Her mother's ghost still falling from the North Tower, Duke Alaric's last breath in the ballroom, the first meeting where Thomas had voted for change before his daughter was murdered for it. The front doors stood open like a mouth. No guards visible, no sentries calling challenges, just darkness waiting to swallow them. Cedric's voice echoed from inside before they reached the entrance. Come in, Miss Ward. Your audience awaits. They entered together, weapons drawn, expecting ambush. Instead, they found theater. The great hall had been arranged like a courtroom. 30 servants sat along one wall, their hands bound, their mouths gagged, their eyes wide with terror. Along the opposite wall stood a dozen men with rifles, professional soldiers who'd sold their loyalty to whoever paid best. And at the far end, sitting in the chair where Duke Alaric had died, was Cedric Vale. He looked different. Thinner from his imprisonment, harder around the eyes, but somehow more alive than Evelyn remembered. As if being exposed and nearly executed had burned away everything soft and left only the essential predator. Welcome home, he said pleasantly. I've been waiting. Let them go. Evelyn's voice echoed in the vast space. Your problem is with me. My problem is with the idea that actions don't have consequences. You started a revolution, Miss Ward. Revolutions are expensive. They require payment in blood. These people, he gestured at the bound servants, are simply making their contribution. They're innocent. No one's innocent. Everyone who works in a castle built on theft shares in the crime. Everyone who benefits from a corrupt system perpetuates it. You taught me that with your speeches about accountability. I'm simply applying your logic. Cedric stood and moved closer to the edge of the dais. Or did you mean accountability only applies to people you decide are guilty? You murdered my mother. I did. Just like you murdered Marcus Dane. Just like your friends destroyed buildings and killed people in bank explosions. We're all murderers here, Miss Ward. The only difference is I'm honest about what I am. The words landed like blows because they carried truth twisted just enough to infect. Evelyn felt the weight of every decision, every violent choice, every time she'd justified bloodshed as necessary for the greater good. She'd become something she didn't recognize, something her mother might have been horrified by. But she'd also learned something her mother hadn't lived long enough to understand, that fighting monsters sometimes meant accepting the parts of yourself that were monstrous too. You're right, she said quietly. I have blood on my hands. People died because of choices I made. But the difference between us is I did it to end suffering. You do it because you enjoy the power. Do I? Cedric's smile was cold. Or do I just understand that power is the only currency that matters? That every empire, every government, every system of order is built on the threat of violence? I don't enjoy killing, Miss Ward. I simply refuse to pretend it's not necessary. It's not necessary. It's a choice. And you could choose differently. Could I? Cedric moved down from the dais, his guard shifting to maintain position. Let's test that theory. I'll offer you a deal. You, for them. You surrender, confess to the bombing, accept execution, and I let everyone here go free. Your life for 30 lives. Seems like a bargain for someone who claims to care about reducing suffering. The trap was elegant. Accept, and she died. Her legacy destroyed by a false confession that would let Cedric rewrite history. Refuse, and she proved she valued her own survival over the people she'd claimed to be fighting for. And Cedric knew it. She could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the certainty that he'd constructed a choice with no right answer. James stepped forward. She's not doing this alone. Neither am I. Thomas moved to Evelyn's other side. You want blood? Take ours. But you're not rewriting this story. Everyone knows what you are. Do they? Cedric's voice carried across the hall. Because right now the official story is that terrorists attacked Parliament and nearly killed the king, that a group of radicals destroyed banks and murdered civilians, that I'm a loyal servant of the crown helping restore order. His smile widened. Your truth died in the explosion I arranged. All that's left is my version, and my version doesn't include noble revolutionaries, just criminals and the man who stopped them. Vivian laughed, a sound without humor. You think you've won, but you're standing in a castle that's already been exposed as corrupt. You're wearing authority granted by a government everyone knows is criminal. You haven't restored order, you've just made the cage more obvious. Cages work regardless of whether people see them, Cedric said. All that matters is they can't escape. He gestured to his guards, and rifles rose, dozens of barrels pointed at 4 people who'd walked into death with their eyes open. This was the end, then. The place where revolution met reality and learned that courage didn't stop bullets. Evelyn felt strange peace settle over her. She'd done everything she could. Exposed truths that would outlive her. Created cracks in a system that would eventually fracture under its own weight. It wasn't victory, but it was something. A beginning that others would finish. She thought about her mother, about that final fall, about whether Margaret Ward had felt this same calm in her last moments. Whether she'd understood that some battles were won across generations, that individual lives mattered less than the direction they pointed toward. Do it, Evelyn said quietly. Pull the triggers. Kill us all. But know that every person watching, every servant bound against that wall, will remember this moment. Will remember that the man restored to power executed people who tried to expose corruption. And they'll tell their children, who'll tell theirs, until your name becomes synonymous with everything rotten in this empire. Cedric's jaw tightened. The guard's fingers tensed on triggers. The moment stretched thin as wire pulled to breaking, and then the doors behind them burst open. A flood of people poured into the great hall. Tenant farmers with pitchforks and rifles, factory workers with clubs and knives, servants from other estates who'd heard what was happening and decided they'd had enough of watching power devour everything. Hundreds of them, filling the space until Cedric's dozen guards looked like an island surrounded by an ocean of rage. At the front of the crowd was a woman Evelyn had never seen before. Middle-aged, plain-dressed, carrying nothing but determination in her eyes. She walked directly to Cedric and stopped 3 feet away. My name is Sarah Kellerman, James's mother. You killed my husband in 1809 because he was investigating your theft. I've waited 15 years for this moment. Behind her, others stepped forward, each one carrying a story of loss that bore Cedric's fingerprints. My son died because you raised rents until we couldn't afford food. My wife died in childbirth because you wouldn't pay for a doctor. My daughter was beaten by your men when she tried to organize workers. On and on, a litany of suffering, each person a witness to crimes that Cedric had committed and forgotten, because individual lives meant nothing when you had power. Cedric looked around at the crowd, and for the first time Evelyn saw something other than confidence in his eyes. Fear, maybe. A recognition that he'd miscalculated something fundamental about how much people would tolerate before they broke. His guards were backing toward him now, their rifles lowering as they understood that shooting would start a massacre they couldn't survive. The math was simple. 12 bullets against hundreds of bodies. They might kill some, but they'd be torn apart by the rest. Stand down, Cedric ordered his men. His voice was calm but strained. This is a misunderstanding. I'm here under royal authority. Your authority means nothing here. Sarah Kellerman's voice carried across the hall. You've stolen from us, murdered us, treated us like we were less than human for generations. And we're done. No more violence, no more revenge, just justice. She pulled a length of rope from her coat. We're taking you to London. We're putting you on trial again, this one public and fair. And whatever happens after that, you'll face it like everyone else. without privilege, without protection, just a man answering for what he's done. Cedric looked at the rope, then at the crowd, then at Evelyn. In his eyes, she saw understanding that this was how empires actually ended. Not in grand battles, but in the slow accumulation of small refusals from people who'd been stepped on too many times. "You think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. "You think justice solves what's broken?" "No," Evelyn said, "but it's a start. And sometimes starting is enough." The guards surrendered their weapons. The servants were freed, and Cedric Vale was bound by people whose names he'd never bothered to learn, but whose lives he'd destroyed in passing. As they led him from the castle, Evelyn stood in the great hall and felt something break and mend inside her simultaneously. They hadn't won, but they hadn't lost either. They'd survived, and survival was its own kind of victory when you fought against systems designed to grind you into dust. The second trial took 3 months to prepare and 2 weeks to complete. This time there was no bought judge, no rigged jury, no backroom deals. Just evidence and witnesses and the slow machinery of justice operating in public view where corruption had nowhere to hide. Cedric Vale was found guilty on 43 counts of murder, systematic fraud, theft, and corruption. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on a gray Tuesday that felt appropriate for endings. Evelyn attended the execution, not out of revenge or satisfaction, but because she owed it to her mother and everyone else who'd died to see this through to its conclusion. She stood in the crowd outside the prison and watched as Cedric was led to the scaffold, his hands bound, his face calm. He looked for her in the crowd and found her. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, she saw not a monster but a man who'd made different choices from the same fears, who'd looked at a corrupt system and decided to master it rather than change it, who'd become exactly what the world taught him to be. "Any last words?" the executioner asked. Cedric's voice carried across the silent crowd. "Empires are built by people like me and destroyed by people like her. But new empires always rise. Human nature doesn't change just because you've had one revolution. Remember that when you're building whatever comes next." Then the trapdoor opened and Cedric Vale fell into whatever waited after death, taking with him the last living connection to the old order that had ruled England for centuries. Evelyn turned away before the body stopped moving. She'd seen enough death, caused enough death. It was time to build something instead of destroying. Barset. The reforms came slowly, fought at every step by people who'd benefited from the old system and couldn't imagine functioning in a new one. But they came. Rents were reduced. Workers gained rights, courts were reformed, banks were regulated. Nothing perfect, nothing revolutionary, just small improvements that accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. Blackthorn Castle was transformed into a school, not for nobles' children, but for everyone. The first year, 300 students enrolled. By the 5th year, it was 1,000. Learning that had once been hoarded became something shared, and with it came the slow realization that empires built on ignorance were fragile things that crumbled when you educated the people they oppressed. Evelyn taught there sometimes, though she was terrible at it. She'd never learned patience, never mastered the art of explaining things gently. But students listened anyway because she'd survived what they only read about in books, because she carried scars that made her real in a way that theory never could be. James married a teacher from the village and had 3 children who would never know starvation. Thomas Webb lived to see his grandson graduate, then died peacefully in a bed surrounded by family instead of alone in a field. Vivian served 2 years in prison for blackmail, then emerged and wrote a book about corruption that sold 100,000 copies and ruined another dozen reputations of people who thought they'd escape justice. Lady Margaret Sinclair passed away in her sleep at 79, her last words a whisper about how proud she was of the girl who'd finished what so many had started. And Evelyn grew older, the weight of what she'd done settling into her bones like cold that never quite left. She'd killed people, destroyed lives, made choices that haunted her dreams and turned her into something her mother might not have recognized. But she'd also changed things, made life bearable for people who'd had nothing, proved that power could be challenged, that corruption could be exposed, that empires were maintained only as long as people agreed to maintain them. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't any kind of moral absolution. It was just life, continuing forward, carrying the past, but not trapped by it. Yes, 15 years after Cedric's execution, Evelyn stood in the castle cemetery where her mother was buried. The headstone was simple. Margaret Ward, who died believing truth mattered. Beside it was a newer stone. Duke Alaric Ravenshade, who learned too late but learned anyway. She came here once a year on the anniversary of her mother's death, not to mourn, but to remember. To keep fresh the understanding of what it cost to fight power, what it meant to make impossible choices, why some battles had to be fought even when losing was inevitable. A figure approached across the grass. Younger woman, maybe 20, wearing the uniform of a castle teacher. She stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Ward, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say thank you. My grandmother worked here as a servant. She was in the Great Hall that night. You saved her life." "I didn't save anyone." Evelyn's voice was rough from disuse. "A lot of people died because of choices I made, but a lot more people lived. My grandmother, my mother, me, we exist because you fought." The young woman hesitated. "Was it worth it, everything you lost?" Evelyn considered the question. She thought about her mother, about James's nightmares, about Thomas's daughter and grandson, and all the people who'd paid the price of revolution with their lives. She thought about Cedric Vale's last words about empires rising and falling and human nature never changing. And she thought about the school behind her, filled with children learning that power came from knowledge and cooperation rather than violence and theft. About workers who could feed their families. About a system still corrupt but less so, still brutal but not quite as murderous. "I don't know," she finally said. "Ask me again in 100 years when we see if any of this lasted." The young woman smiled and left. Evelyn remained, standing between two graves that represented everything she'd fought for and everything she'd lost. The wind moved through trees planted after the revolution, their roots breaking up soil that had been soaked in blood. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was perfect. The powerful still exploited the powerless, just more carefully now. Corruption still existed, just better hidden. Injustice continued, just with prettier justifications. But the direction had changed. The trajectory bent towards something that might eventually be called justice if enough people kept pushing. That was all revolution ever really accomplished, changing the angle, altering the course, pointing toward a horizon that would take generations to reach. Evelyn Ward had been her mother's daughter and Cedric Vale's enemy, and a revolutionary and a murderer and a savior and a symbol and a warning. She'd been all those things and none of them, just a person trying to do right in a world designed to punish it. And in the end, that was enough. Not satisfying, not redemptive, not the clean ending that stories promised, just enough. She turned from the graves and walked back toward the castle where children were learning that the world could be different than it was. Whether they'd actually make it different was their choice to make, their battles to fight, their blood to spill or spare. Hers was done. The sun broke through clouds as she reached the castle doors, and for just a moment the light touched stone that had witnessed centuries of cruelty and made it look almost beautiful. Almost like something worth saving. Almost like hope, if you squinted and didn't look too close at the cracks. She went inside, closing the door behind her, leaving the past where it belonged while the future waited, uncertain and terrifying and possible in ways it hadn't been before someone decided truth was worth dying for. That was her mother's gift. And Cedric's curse. And her own legacy, built from both their lessons. Power could be fought. Systems could be changed. Empires could fall. But the cost was always blood, and the victory was never clean, and the work was never finished. That was the truth no one wanted to hear. That was the truth that mattered most. And somewhere in the unmarked grave where Cedric Vale rotted, that truth smiled its terrible smile and waited patiently for the next empire to rise so it could teach the same lesson again to people who thought this time would be different. It never was. But maybe if enough people kept trying, kept fighting, kept bleeding for the impossible dream that justice could matter more than power, maybe someday it would be. That hope, fragile and foolish and necessary, was what kept her walking forward. It was enough. It had to be.